Hi guys, tonight we are stepping into a Viking longhouse on a night so cold your breath freezes before you finish saying it. Picture it. Snow crunching outside. Icy wind pressing against timber walls. The flicker of firelight throwing shadows across smoky rafters. You lie down on a bench, wrapped in animal skins, and the first thought that hits you is simple. How on earth did anyone survive this? The second thought is even sharper. You probably wouldn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone is listening from across the world. Now dim the lights because this story will carry you deep into the heart of Viking nights. The Longhouse itself is your shield against the Arctic chill, but only just. Built of heavy timber, sealed with turf and mud, the hall is wide enough to house a family and their animals, yet drafty enough that the cold seeps in through every crack. You stretch out on the rough planks and feel the icy air crawling across your face, a reminder that insulation is a modern luxury. Historical sources describe longhouses as smoky, dark, and perpetually damp, but they were also strong against the endless winters of Scandinavia. What you notice first is the smell. Wood smoke hanging thick in the rafters, tinged with wet earth from the turf roof, and the musky scent of animals penned at the far end. It's an aroma that clings to skin, hair, and bedding, something you carry with you whether you like it or not. Archaeologists have found carbon deposits blackening timbers from centuries of smoke, proof that fires burned constantly. You can almost hear the hiss of logs dropped onto glowing embers, the crackle pushing back against the silence of the night. Here's the mainstream fact. The Longhouse was the central building of Viking society, stretching up to 70 feet in some cases, with a hearth running down the middle. Without it, survival in Scandinavian winters would have been impossible. But quirky details surface too, like the fact that some longhouses were so poorly ventilated that guests often complained about choking smoke. Imagine trying to fall asleep when every breath feels like inhaling a bonfire. Some even suggested the constant smoke actually preserved the roof timbers, killing pests that would otherwise rot the wood. So yes, smoke might irritate your lungs, but it was accidentally acting as pest control. You roll onto your side and listen. The Longhouse is alive with sound, low animal grunts, the shuffle of bodies turning on straw bedding, a cough here, a muttered prayer there. It's not the serene silence of a modern bedroom. It's a living barn. The walls creak against the wind, and you feel each gust squeeze through the seams like icy fingers. And yet, against all odds, there's warmth in this communal closeness. Scholars continue to puzzle over how effective these halls truly were. Some argue they provided reasonable shelter thanks to turf insulation and tightly laid planks. Others insist that sleeping inside was little warmer than being outdoors, only with less wind. Which side is right? That remains a debate, but what's clear is that Vikings accepted discomfort as part of existence. For them, shivering under furs wasn't failure. It was daily life. Close your eyes now and picture the scene. Outside, auroras ripple across the northern sky. But inside the hall, your world is shadows, firelight, and the muffled sound of bodies pressed together against winter's bite. The fire glows at the center, painting everything in shades of amber and smoke. Your fingers stiffen from the chill, and yet you cling to the comfort of fur and family. This was survival, not luxury, and as you drift closer to sleep, you wonder what other tricks did these people use to hold back the cold. The hall around you creaks under its own weight. a hulking body of timber and turf pressing into the earth. You trace the walls with your eyes, noticing how they are thick, almost smothering, as though the Vikings knew very well that thin planks would never withstand the bitter cold. These walls are layered, a puzzle of logs, clay, and sod stacked deliberately to keep the chill at bay. If you imagine stepping outside into the snowstorm that beats against the longhouse, the contrast is dramatic. Inside, it may not be toasty, but it is survivable. And that was often the difference between life and death. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia consistently show the same pattern. Longhouses built with turf roofs and earth layers packed around timber frames. This wasn't by accident. That much is certain from the physical evidence still sitting in the ground. The roof sloped low, helping snow pile up like an insulating blanket, while the walls leaned inward as though the entire house hunched down against the wind. You can almost feel the weight of snow pressing overhead. Yet instead of collapsing, the structure actually became warmer as the snow sealed gaps. It's an ingenious adaptation. You build a roof. The sky adds insulation for free. Still, the experience of living inside one was not romantic. The interior was dim, cramped, and streaked with soot from countless fires. Yet it was the very design, the turf, the logs, the way the house sat low in the landscape that allowed families to survive Arctic nights. Most modern visitors would probably complain within an hour, shivering and coughing. But Vikings called this comfort. And here's a curious twist. There are records of similar turf house designs surviving well into the modern period in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. In fact, Icelandic farmhouses were still being made with thick turf layers until the 19th century. Imagine that, a method so effective it lasted nearly 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended. It wasn't nostalgia. It was sheer practicality. Now you pull your cloak tighter and notice the texture of the inner walls. They aren't smooth. They bulge where turf and mud were packed in, and they flake where smoke has charred them black. The smell is always present, almost sour from trapped moisture, but this was life. The walls did not merely enclose. They breathed, absorbing damp air and releasing smoke slowly through the roof. Did it really keep things warmer than a simpler timber shack? Some specialists say yes, that the turf acted like modern insulation. Others argue the benefit was minimal, that the real warmth came only from the fire itself. And there you are, lying on your bedding, still wondering which side has it right. The soundscape adds another layer of reality. You hear the groan of beams under snow load, the occasional drip of water where ice has melted through the roof, and the dull thud of wind shoving against the turf siding. In the absence of windows, every sense sharpens. You rely on ears, nose, and skin to tell you what's happening in the dark. The walls don't just stand still. They seem alive, creaking, breathing, sheltering, and barely holding back the northern night. It is worth remembering that these structures weren't meant to be permanent in the modern sense. A longhouse could last a generation or two, maybe longer if well maintained, before the wood rotted or the turf degraded. Yet for that span of time, it gave a family and their animals the chance to weather winters that would otherwise be impossible. Most experts today agree that the sheer scale of these houses, up to 20 meters long, was itself part of the heating strategy. The more people and livestock inside, the more heat generated. The house didn't just shield against cold. It trapped body warmth. And here's one of those details that makes you pause. Some excavation sites show longhouses dug slightly into the ground, a technique that used the earth itself as a kind of insulation. You lie back and imagine the walls not rising from the soil but sinking into it. The cold wind sweeping just over the roofline while the ground cradles you in damp, muted quiet. It's not glamorous, but it's efficient. That little design trick might have saved countless lives, but historians don't always agree on how much comfort these houses provided. A number of them argue that longhouses were chronically smoky and cold, barely fit for habitation, and that survival depended far more on fur clothing than on architecture. Others counter with evidence of carefully planned airflow systems, suggesting that the Vikings knew more about ventilation than we give them credit for. Without written manuals left behind, the truth drifts between these positions, and you're left lying under the turf roof, breathing in the mixture of warmth and smoke, and wondering which interpretation best matches reality. Now, as you settle into your imagination of this longhouse night, you notice the communal aspect once again. The house was never empty. The thickness of the walls made it feel like a fortress, but it was the people inside who made it a home. Children's whispers, animal snorts, the rhythmic breathing of your neighbor, all these sounds bounce off turf and timber, weaving into a lullaby of survival. In a world where snowstorms could erase entire villages, the longhouse stood like a womb, protective and close. One thing is clear: the Viking longhouse was not a place of luxury, but a compromise with nature. Its design was simple, yet layered with purpose. It absorbed snow, trapped heat, muffled wind, and sheltered both human and animal life together. You may wrinkle your nose at the idea of sharing a smoky room with cows and goats, but to the Vikings, that meant extra warmth. As you lie there, your mind drifts to how much effort it must have taken to build such a structure, felling trees with iron axes, hauling turf blocks, layering mud, all in freezing temperatures. The very existence of the longhouse speaks of endurance and stubbornness, qualities that defined the people themselves. You wonder if, in the act of building, they already felt warmer, knowing that each log raised and each turf laid would carry them through another year. Outside, the storm still howls, but in here, the heavy walls blunt its fury. The longhouse creaks and sighs, the fire sputters, and your breath mixes with smoke and steam from damp earth. It isn't comfortable, not in the way you know comfort. Yet for the Vikings, this was the margin between life and death. And as your eyes close again, you realize the brilliance of their compromise, not conquering the cold, but outlasting it. The glow of the central fire becomes your entire horizon. It is more than warmth. It is life itself, the axis around which the longhouse turns. Every Viking night spiraled outward from that blaze, and without it, the hall would collapse into cold silence. You stretch out and feel the heat ebb and flow across your skin like the tide. Too close and you sweat. Too far, and your toes stiffen in the frost. The fire is fickle, generous and dangerous in the same breath. What archaeologists consistently find in excavation sites are long troughs of burned earth running through the middle of these halls. These are the remains of open hearths, sometimes stretching the length of the room, other times broken into sections. That evidence is firm. The fire always sat at the center of Viking life, literally. From it came heat, light, and a place for cooking. Without that flame, no one in the room would have slept, eaten, or even survived. And yet, here's a curious detail. Some sagas mention fires being carefully banked with ash at night, so they would smolder until morning. This technique kept the embers alive without burning through precious fuel. You imagine a Viking carefully kneeling, scooping gray powder over glowing coals, sealing the warmth in like treasure under a blanket of ash. It's the ancient version of hitting the snooze button, ensuring the house would awaken with a little glow ready to be coaxed back into flame. But living with fire meant living with risk. Sparks leaping from logs could easily catch on straw bedding or woolen cloaks. One stray ember, and the longhouse could become a furnace. The smell of scorched fur or singed clothing probably wasn't rare. In fact, some experts point out that the very length of these hearths increased danger. The bigger the fire, the bigger the chance of disaster. And still, people lay down around it every night, because the alternative was freezing to death. As you shift in your imagined bedding, you notice how uneven the heat really feels. One side of your body basks in warmth, while the other is chilled, exposed to drafts creeping under the door. This push and pull of firelight is exactly what Viking families endured. Too near the blaze, you choke on smoke and risk burns. Too far, you curl your body tighter, pressing against others just to keep the edge of warmth. Contemporary scholars aren't in agreement about how these fires were managed. Some believe there were raised stone borders to contain the blaze. Others argue that the evidence of flat hearths suggests no barriers, just open flames flickering through the night. It's an unsettled question, and the lack of preserved stonework in many excavations leaves the truth elusive. You're left to picture it either way: a neat glowing channel or a sprawling pile of embers scattering sparks in the dark. Let your ears tune in to the sounds around the hearth. The wood crackles sharply, punctuated by softer hisses as sap bursts under heat. The fire spits, and occasionally a log shifts with a low thud. These noises carry across the longhouse, mixing with the steady rhythm of breath from those lying nearby. The fire doesn't just heat the body, it calms the mind. In a world where nights stretched endlessly long, that hypnotic sound must have been its own kind of lullaby. One thing widely accepted is that the fire was the only real source of light inside. Oil lamps or torches might have been used occasionally, but they were secondary. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded hall by a single glowing strip of flame. Shadows loom and shift, flickering against turf walls. Children wake and mistake them for spirits. The supernatural and the ordinary blur in firelight, and stories grow from these shapes. It's easy to see how sagas of ghosts, gods, and heroes could bloom in that half-lit world. Here's a side note worth savoring. Some Viking longhouses contained multiple hearths, not just one. In Greenland, excavations revealed large halls with several fire pits, possibly serving different families or functions. That suggests a communal yet divided space, like having multiple little worlds under the same roof. You imagine the heat zones overlapping, families huddled around their own glow, each fire a private island in the smoky sea of the hall. But of course, the downside is smoke itself. With no chimneys in the early designs, the smoke rose and pooled under the rafters before seeping out through the roof. The upper air of the hall was thick with soot, and rafters blackened after only a few winters. Visitors often described Viking interiors as choking and dim. Some scholars even theorize that people slept low to the ground, partly to avoid the densest smoke above. It's an ironic survival strategy. The hearth gives life, but you have to crawl away from its breath to live through the night. Think, for a moment, about the sensory overload this created. The heat swells, the smoke stings your eyes, and yet the alternative is worse. You lie with tears streaking your face, coughing, but still clinging to warmth. Was it worth it? Every Viking would have said yes. There's also an intriguing possibility raised by some experts that the fire itself wasn't just practical but sacred. The hearth may have been considered a spiritual center, with household gods or protective spirits bound to it. Feeding the fire, tending its embers, these could have been acts of reverence as much as necessity. You picture a mother whispering a quiet prayer as she lays out a log, trusting that flame to keep her children alive until dawn. Now imagine the rhythm of an entire night shaped by this glow. The fire dims, people stir to add wood, smoke thickens, the hall dozes off again. The cycle repeats until dawn finally streaks gray through cracks in the roof. You never sleep deeply, not in a longhouse. Instead, you hover between waking and dreaming, your body tuned to the life of the hearth. And so, as you settle closer to that imagined flame, you realize its paradox. It is both protector and threat, both comfort and suffocation. Without it, you'd never see another morning. But with it, you pay the price in smoke, danger, and restless nights. Yet for the Vikings, this balance was normal. The heartbeat of their world. The longer you lie inside this smoky hall, the more you notice the strange dance of air. One moment, the smoke drifts lazily upward, curling into the rafters like gray ribbons. The next, it surges downward, stinging your throat and making your eyes water. You cough, pull your cloak tighter, and realize ventilation was the hidden puzzle of the Viking longhouse. Too much of it, and you froze. Too little, and you suffocated. There was no perfect balance, only a constant negotiation between cold air and smoky warmth. Archaeological remains reveal simple roof vents, gaps in the ridge where smoke could escape. These are not ornate chimneys but narrow slits, sometimes covered with movable boards or turf that could be adjusted depending on wind and weather. You can almost picture a weary Viking nudging a roof board into place, muttering at the swirling smoke that refused to cooperate. The concept was rudimentary but clever. Create just enough suction to pull the smoke skyward while letting as little heat escape as possible. And yet, even with these innovations, the evidence of blackened rafters and soot-choked timbers tells the story clearly. Smoke lingered. It coated surfaces, seeped into clothing, and left every longhouse smelling like an overworked bonfire. Many researchers believe this was not simply a minor annoyance, but a chronic health problem. Imagine breathing that air every night of your life. Eyes burning, lungs irritated, sleep disturbed. The walls kept out the wind, but the fire filled your chest with ash. Here's a curious observation. Despite the obvious discomfort, some experts argue that smoky interiors had unintended benefits. The constant haze likely repelled insects, keeping flies and mosquitoes at bay during warmer months. The smoke may also have slowed the growth of bacteria in food storage areas. So while your body ached from coughing, your supplies lasted longer and your livestock stayed healthier. It's a strange trade-off, unhealthy for the lungs, yet helpful for survival overall. The sensation of lying in that haze is almost tangible when you imagine it. Your skin prickles from the sting in the air, your hair smells permanently of wood smoke, and your ears catch every shift of the draft. Ventilation becomes an obsession. Which way is the wind blowing? Should you open the smoke hole wider? Do you dare risk losing precious heat? These decisions determine whether the family coughed all night or froze in silence. Specialists continue to argue over how effective these smoke holes really were. Some believe they provided sufficient airflow, especially when combined with cracks in the walls. Others insist they were little more than symbolic gestures, barely improving conditions at all. With no intact roof system surviving, the debate lingers in academic circles, unresolved. You're left to imagine the tug of war, heat slipping out, smoke pressing in, people shifting uncomfortably under their blankets, caught in the balance. And then there's the unsettling detail that smoke didn't just rise harmlessly. The soot actually built up in layers, thick enough that some roof beams preserved today are nearly lacquered black. In places, archaeologists have scraped away centuries of hardened residue, a grim reminder of how many fires once roared beneath. If the walls of those longhouses could speak, they would wheeze. Yet, against this harsh reality comes another strange benefit. The very soot that coated the timbers may have strengthened them, sealing wood against insects and decay. What seemed like ruinous pollution might have doubled as preservation. You imagine Viking builders nodding with satisfaction, not because they understood chemistry, but because the beams simply lasted longer than expected. Survival sometimes came by accident. Now listen more closely to the sounds inside the smoky hall. You hear a child's soft whimper from the sting in her eyes, a goat coughing faintly in the far corner, and the shuffle of a man rising to poke at the fire. Every movement stirs the smoke again, and the rhythm of night is broken by these small interruptions. There is no clean, peaceful sleep, only the uneasy rest of bodies adapting to air that always tastes of fire. Some sagas even allude to this difficulty, hinting at characters who lay in smoke or who cursed at the black haze that clung to rafters. The language itself preserves the memory of discomfort. Yet, as inconvenient as it sounds, people grew accustomed to it. Just as modern city dwellers learned to ignore the hum of traffic, Vikings must have taught themselves to breathe through smoke, cough, roll over, and keep sleeping. It was the price of warmth. Consider also the psychological side of it. In the dim haze, shadows twisted across walls, making rafters loom like giants. The mind, half awake and stinging from smoke, might easily conjure shapes of spirits, ancestors, or wandering gods. Could it be that the smoke fed the imagination, helping stories take form in the fire-lit dark? Folklorists suspect as much, noting how many Norse myths are steeped in imagery of haze, twilight, and shadows. In this way, choking on smoke might have also meant breathing life into myth. The paradox is clear. Ventilation meant compromise. The smoke hole was a lifeline, yet never fully successful. The cold forced the roof shut, the fire forced it open. Families walked that thin line every night, adjusting, coughing, and enduring. And as you nestle deeper into your furs in this imagined hall, you realize you too are caught in that ancient negotiation. Every breath is a reminder. Warmth never came free. Your back aches from the hard planks. So you shift slightly and discover another secret of Viking nights: the raised sleeping platforms. These weren't ornate beds with carved posts or mattresses filled with feathers. They were simple benches built along the longhouse walls, wide enough for a family to sprawl across, sometimes just a rough plank or a layer of woven branches topped with straw. But compared to lying directly on the dirt floor, they were a step into comfort and, more importantly, survival. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these platforms in excavated halls, post holes running along the walls, discolored patches of earth where wood once rested, even layers of decayed straw pressed into the soil. The evidence is consistent enough that most scholars agree these raised benches were standard features. Sleeping off the ground served two purposes at once. You avoided the damp chill that seeped up from the earth, and you kept out of the way of small animals or pests. It's one of those adaptations that feels obvious when you think about it, but only because people who froze before you learned it the hard way. Now imagine stretching out on one of these benches. Your body is lifted perhaps a foot or two above the dirt, and immediately the cold lessens. The floor itself is dark, moist, and uneven, but here on the planks you can feel air circulating instead of mud pressing into your bones. A thin layer of straw muffles the hardness of the wood, and animal skins drape across your shoulders like heavy, musky blankets. The difference between shivering through the night and drifting into uneasy dreams often came down to this simple wooden ledge. And here's an unusual detail. Some of these sleeping benches doubled as storage space. People tucked belongings, tools, and sometimes even food beneath them, turning the raised beds into multi-purpose furniture. You might lie down and know that the iron axe you sharpened earlier is resting just below your head, or that your winter root vegetables are tucked safely away from nibbling goats. It wasn't luxury. It was efficiency. But how many people shared these benches? The answer seems to be as many as could fit. Written descriptions from the sagas and ethnographic parallels suggest that whole families squeezed together. Sometimes children sandwiched between parents, sometimes relatives or servants piling into the same row. Privacy was a modern dream. In the longhouse, warmth came before dignity. Your neighbor's elbow might jab your ribs, or their snoring might shake your skull, but their body heat kept you alive. Specialists still disagree on just how wide these platforms were. Some reconstructions show narrow benches hardly larger than modern single beds. Others depict broad ledges stretching the length of the wall, more like communal sofas than individual bunks. With the evidence fragmentary, the debate continues. And as you lie here in your imagined hall, you can picture both possibilities: a cramped personal plank, or a broad communal shelf where half the family piled up in a jumble of limbs and blankets. The sensation of it is easy to conjure. You climb up, feel the wood creak beneath your weight, settle into straw that scratches your skin but smells faintly sweet. Above, rafters groan under snow. Beside you, someone shifts, mutters in their sleep, and presses closer. You are never truly alone here, never separated from the warmth or the noise of others. One particularly odd find at a site in Denmark revealed layers of charred straw bedding, suggesting that sometimes these benches caught fire when sparks flew too far. Imagine the rude awakening of your mattress smoldering beneath you. Did families leap up cursing? Did they simply smother it with cloaks and lie back down, too tired to care? The archaeological scar leaves you guessing, but it's a vivid reminder of how precarious life was, with a central hearth blazing just feet away. The benches also played another subtle role. They turned the longhouse into a tiered environment. Warmth rose, smoke hovered, and those on benches found themselves in the middle zone, not freezing on the ground, not choking at the rafters, but somewhere in between. You might not breathe perfectly clear air, but you weren't suffocating either. It was a compromise position, a practical middle ground carved out of architecture itself. And beyond their function, these raised sleeping spots shaped social life. The benches nearest the fire may have been claimed by elders or by those with higher status, while less favored corners were left to servants or guests. Sleeping arrangements spoke quietly about hierarchy, the placement of bodies reflecting the placement of power. You might think of it as the Viking version of seating charts, only enforced every single night. So as you settle deeper into your imagined bedding, you feel both gratitude and discomfort. Gratitude that you aren't lying directly in the mud, shivering with cold seeping through your bones. Discomfort that you're pressed between relatives, straw itching your skin, the fire spitting sparks too close for comfort. This was the Viking bed, rough, smoky, communal, and yet utterly necessary. The raised platform is no luxury suite, but when winter howls outside and the world freezes solid, It is enough to rest, enough to survive. And as your eyes close in the flicker of firelight, you understand that sometimes survival depends not on conquering the cold, but on finding the smallest edge against it. A plank, a layer of straw, a place one step above the earth. You run your fingers across the surface of your bedding and realize it isn't just rough straw or planks beneath you. There's a layering system at work, one born of necessity. First comes a mattress of dried grass or reeds, refreshed as often as families could manage. Then woolen blankets, and finally the most precious possessions of all, thick animal skins. These were the Viking equivalent of duvets, heavy and warm, their musky scent reminding you that survival smelled like sheep and reindeer more than lavender. Archaeological digs have revealed remnants of bedding material, bits of charred straw, tufts of sheep wool, even hair from goats woven into blankets. These fragments confirm what sagas sometimes hint at. Wool was the bedrock of comfort. Scandinavian sheep, hardy and thick-fleeced, produced fiber strong enough to withstand endless winters. When spun into blankets or cloaks, wool trapped heat even when damp, a miracle fabric long before Gore-Tex existed. You may wrinkle your nose at the itch, but your body thanks it for the warmth. Here's an intriguing sidelight. Not all bedding was purely local. Some furs came from far-off trade routes, bear pelts from the north, beaver skins from the east, even luxurious reindeer hides from Lapland. To sleep beneath such a cover wasn't just comfort. It was status. Imagine lying under a shimmering pelt that had traveled hundreds of miles, proof that your family commanded wealth or connections. Bedding itself became a quiet symbol of prestige. Now lean closer and feel the tactile reality of it. The straw beneath scratches, the wool above itches, and the furs weigh heavy across your chest. Together, though, they create a cocoon against the drafts that sneak through the turf walls. Without these layers, the cold would creep relentlessly, numbing toes and stiffening joints. With them, you might actually drift into dreams instead of shivering through the night. Specialists still question exactly how thick these bedding layers were. Some reconstructions show only a few inches of straw. Others suggest deep piles refreshed regularly, almost like primitive mattresses. There's even debate about whether animal skins were primarily laid beneath sleepers or over them. Did you lie on fur and cover yourself with wool, or the reverse? The physical evidence doesn't settle it, and so the scholarly back and forth continues. You're left to test both versions in your imagination, wondering which one left fewer flea bites. Because fleas were the uninvited guests at every Viking sleepover. Wool and fur may have been warm, but they were also perfect homes for pests. Archaeological studies of Viking burial sites have found traces of insect remains in clothing and bedding, clear signs that itching was part of nightly life. You might laugh at the thought of a warrior who braved icy seas, but cursed it at tiny creatures under his blanket. Survival was never glamorous. And then there's the smell. Wool smelled of lanolin, earthy and slightly oily. Furs carried the musk of the animals they once clothed. Mixed with smoke from the fire and dampness from the turf walls, the longhouse reeked of life, raw and unfiltered. Did people notice? Or had their senses adapted so thoroughly that this bouquet of animal, earth, and ash simply became the smell of home? Anthropologists suspect the latter, pointing out how quickly humans normalize their environments. One charming detail emerges from sagas and folklore. Bedding was sometimes blessed or charmed. A skin laid over a child might be accompanied by whispered words invoking protection from spirits of the cold. This suggests that blankets weren't just physical shields, but spiritual ones as well. To wrap yourself in fur was to wrap yourself in safety, both practical and mystical. You picture a mother smoothing a pelt over her son, murmuring a prayer to Thor or Freyr that the night would pass without harm. Think about the tactile rhythm of these nights. You shift on straw that crinkles under your body, tug a woolen cloak higher over your chin, and feel the heavy drag of a fur pressing you down. The air still carries a bite, but your body heat builds under the layers, turning discomfort into something closer to relief. In that moment, survival doesn't feel heroic. It feels ordinary, just another night endured, just another dawn waiting beyond the snow. So you close your eyes and sink into that layered nest, realizing how simple materials, grass, wool, and hide, became the technology of survival. No silk sheets, no feather beds, just the ingenuity of making do with what nature provided. And yet, despite the itch, the pests, the heaviness, you sleep, because in the Viking world, that was enough. The fur across your chest feels heavier than wool, softer than straw, and undeniably foreign. You notice the difference right away. This isn't from the sheep grazing just outside the longhouse, or from the goats whose bleating fills the night. This pelt has traveled. Its texture tells you it once belonged to a beaver, or perhaps even a bear, animals not native to your farmstead. And that realization opens a new window into Viking life. Their bedding was not just local resourcefulness, but part of a much wider web of trade. Archaeological evidence, coupled with written sources, shows that Vikings did not live in isolation. They voyaged, they raided, they traded, and through these networks came goods that reshaped their homes. Among the most prized were furs. From the Sami of northern Scandinavia came reindeer and fox pelts. From the dense forests of what is now Russia and the Baltic, merchants brought beaver, sable, and marten skins. To lie beneath such covers was more than warmth. It was proof of status. Owning an imported pelt said that your family had reach, influence, and the wealth to acquire it. One well-documented fact is that fur was a cornerstone of Viking commerce. Tribute from conquered lands often came in the form of pelts, and merchants from as far as the Middle East coveted northern furs for their rarity and insulation. In fact, fragments of Arabian silver coins found in Scandinavian soil hint at this trade. Furs moving south, silver moving north. And some of those furs didn't just line cloaks. They lined bedding, softening the Viking night. But there's a quirky story attached too. Medieval chroniclers occasionally describe the Sami trading reindeer hides not just for tools or iron, but for dairy products, suggesting that bedding warmth might literally have been bought with buckets of milk or cheese. Picture it: a Viking farmer clutching a bundle of reindeer hides earned by trading goat cheese, dragging it home and spreading it proudly across his family's bed platform. Survival stitched itself together from unexpected bargains. When you press your cheek into one of these imported furs, the experience is different from local wool. The fur is sleeker, more supple, and often better at trapping heat. Reindeer hides in particular were legendary for their insulating qualities, used even in modern Arctic expeditions. Imagine the relief of a Viking child crawling under such a cover, feeling its weight and warmth, cocooned against drafts sneaking through turf walls. For that child, survival had been carried across miles of icy wilderness. Scholars continue to debate just how widespread these imported furs were in everyday households. Some argue that they were rare luxuries, reserved for wealthy chieftains and their families. Others suggest that trade was extensive enough that even modest farmers might occasionally sleep under foreign pelts, at least for special occasions or during the most brutal winters. with evidence scattered and fragmentary. The truth sits in that gray zone, neither fully common nor entirely elite, but whether rare or not, the symbolism mattered. Furs carried prestige. They were visible proof of connection beyond the village, tokens of the Viking world's reach. To lie under an imported pelt wasn't just comfort. It was a statement, whispered into the smoky dark. We belong to something larger than this hall. Close your eyes and imagine the sensation now. Your shoulders sink beneath the softness, your body heat sealed in by layers more efficient than anything local wool could provide. Around you, others murmur and sleep, perhaps jealous of your fur or comforted by their own. The fire flickers, smoke curls above, and outside, the snow piles higher. You are wrapped not only in warmth, but in the long threads of trade, war, and travel that wove the Viking Age together. In this way, even the act of sleeping became part of a global network. You think of silver coins crossing seas, of beaver pelts changing hands in forest clearings, of caravans moving silently through snowbound passes. All of it ends here, in this longhouse, where you finally relax enough to drift into uneasy dreams. The furs may itch, they may smell faintly of musk, but they carry with them the breath of distant lands. And in the middle of a Scandinavian winter, that was a kind of magic one that could make the difference between shivering awake and sleeping. Through until dawn, you shift under the heavy hides and realize just how crowded this space really is. The Longhouse isn't a quiet retreat for a single family. It is a hive. The benches along the walls are filled not with neat rows of sleepers, but with bodies jumbled together. Grandparents, parents, children, servants, even the occasional guest, everyone crammed shoulder to shoulder. The very architecture demanded it. With walls so thick and space so precious, the best way to stay warm was to share the air, the furs, and sometimes even the same blanket. Archaeologists studying Longhouse remains often point out the sheer size of these halls, some stretching 20 or 30 meters in length. That wasn't because Vikings wanted extra elbow room. It was because multiple family units, and sometimes multiple generations, lived under one roof. It was less a house than a community building, a micro-village pressed into a smoky wooden shell. One surviving saga casually mentions 3 households sharing the same hall, and you can almost feel the press of bodies now, as you try to roll over without knocking someone else in the face. The benefits were practical. More people meant more heat. A dozen bodies lying close together created a microclimate of shared warmth. In an age when insulation was patchy and fire unreliable, this collective heat was a survival strategy. You may not have enjoyed sleeping so near to your grumpy uncle or the servant who hadn't bathed in months, but their body heat might mean you woke up alive. And there's an odd little aside preserved in folklore. Some families supposedly arranged sleepers strategically, with children tucked between adults to maximize warmth. Imagine being wedged between 2 snoring parents, wrapped in their cloaks, while cousins and grandparents formed a human wall against the cold air seeping in from the door. The Longhouse became less like a bedroom and more like a living blanket, each body another patch sewn into the quilt of survival. Still, this closeness came at a cost. Privacy, as you understand it, didn't exist. Every cough, every mutter, every restless turn was shared with the entire room. Quarrels couldn't be whispered without everyone overhearing. Intimacy was never truly private. And yet, for Vikings, this was normal. Modern sensibilities would call it suffocating. They called it life. Scholars still wrestle with how these shared spaces shaped social dynamics. Did constant proximity strengthen kinship bonds, or did it spark simmering tensions? Some anthropologists suggest that such tight quarters bred extraordinary cooperation. Families who had to endure nights nose to nose learned patience and tolerance. Others counter that sagas full of feuds and rivalries hint at the opposite, that living stacked together like firewood fueled resentment as much as solidarity. Both views hold water, and you, lying on your straw mattress, might agree with either depending on whose elbow just jabbed you in the ribs. Close your eyes now and imagine the sensory storm, the warmth of shared bodies, the mingled smells of sweat, wool, and smoke, the sound of snoring layered like a chorus across the hall. Somewhere a baby fusses. Somewhere else a dog growls softly in its sleep. This isn't a serene silence. It's a cacophony. And yet, amid that noise, there's comfort. You are never alone. One peculiar note from excavation sites: benches sometimes appear to have been built at slightly different heights, perhaps dividing one family's sleeping area from another's. You might picture shallow ledges stepping up along the wall, each clan claiming their level. The arrangement created not just warmth but hierarchy. Whose bench sat nearest the fire? Whose was shunted toward the drafty end by the doorway? The politics of sleeping arrangements spoke as loudly as words at the daytime feast. So, as you settle into your imagination of this crowded hall, you realize something vital. The longhouse wasn't designed for the individual. It was designed for the group. Survival wasn't a solitary act. It was communal, noisy, sometimes uncomfortable, but deeply human. You shared not only stories and meals, but also your very body heat, night after night, winter after winter. And in that closeness, sweaty, smoky, and undeniably cramped, there was also a kind of security. If danger approached, if a storm tore at the roof, if illness struck, you weren't isolated. You were surrounded, woven into the fabric of kin. In the Viking world, that closeness might have been the warmest thing of all. You stir in the smoky dark, and the warmth you feel doesn't just come from your family pressed against you. It comes from something larger and heavier at the far end of the hall. There, behind a wooden partition or a low fence, animals shift and breathe, their hot, moist exhalations adding to the fog of the longhouse. Cows, sheep, goats, and even pigs often shared the roof with their human keepers. And while it might sound unpleasant to modern ears, this mingling of species was one of the most practical heating systems the Vikings had. Archaeological digs consistently reveal longhouses divided into sections, one end for living, one end for livestock, sometimes separated only by a waist-high wall. The evidence is unmistakable: troughs carved into the floor for feeding, post holes for pens, even layers of compacted manure still preserved in the soil. It's not guesswork. These halls doubled as barns. When winter set in, animals weren't left outside to freeze. They became roommates, breathing furnaces that helped keep the human half of the house just a little warmer. Close your eyes and imagine it. The thick, pungent scent of hay and manure rising through the smoky air. The sound of hooves shifting restlessly. The low rumble of a cow's breath on the other side of the partition. At first, it seems intolerable. But then the warmth reaches you, subtle but steady, seeping across the hall like a second hearth. Every animal became a radiator, their bodies contributing to the invisible tide of heat that pooled under the turf roof. One reliable fact is that cows produce an impressive amount of body heat. Modern farmers even calculate this, knowing a single cow radiates hundreds of watts of energy. Multiply that by a herd, and suddenly you've got a natural heating system. The Vikings may not have measured it in watts, but they understood its value. Livestock were more than food on hooves. They were winter partners, shoring up human survival with every exhale. And here's an oddly amusing detail. Sagas and later folklore sometimes poke fun at the smell of these arrangements, with characters teased for sleeping with cows. The humor suggests everyone knew it was both necessary and unpleasant. Imagine rolling over, pulling your cloak across your nose, and muttering about the neighbor's goat bleeding all night. Yet, when the storm raged outside, you'd be grateful for every warm breath drifting across that partition. Specialists still debate how tightly integrated the animal and human sections were. Some reconstructions show clear barriers, with animals penned neatly away. Others suggest only a symbolic division, meaning that goats could wander dangerously close to your bedding if you weren't careful. The lack of intact interiors leaves the question open, and you're left to picture both versions, sometimes orderly, sometimes chaotic, but always full of smells and sounds that modern bedrooms would never tolerate. The presence of animals didn't just change the climate. It changed the rhythm of sleep. You'd hear the shuffle of hooves, the soft chewing of hay, the snorts and sighs of creatures bedding down. Children may have found comfort in these sounds, lulled by the heartbeat-like rhythm of cows settling into the night. Adults, on the other hand, might curse when a restless sheep startled awake and bleated loudly at midnight. Either way, sleep was never fully silent. There's even an argument among some researchers that the manure itself, layered on the far side of the hall, released a little heat as it decomposed. You might laugh at the thought of a dung-heated Viking home, but decomposition does produce warmth. Was it noticeable, or just a smelly byproduct? The debate lingers, unresolved, leaving you to wonder if those stinking piles actually contributed to keeping children's toes from freezing beyond warmth. The livestock brought another kind of security. To keep your animals inside meant they were safe from predators and theft. In a world where a family's wealth was measured in cows and sheep, guarding them overnight wasn't optional. You and your goats endured the same smoky air, not because it was fun, but because it meant survival for both. So as you settle deeper into your furs in this imagined longhouse, the warmth that surrounds you is layered and complex. Fire flickers at the center, families breathe heavily along the benches, and animals exhale steadily from the far end. The entire hall becomes an ecosystem of shared heat. You may wrinkle your nose at the pungency, but you sigh with relief too. Because in the frozen north, every warm breath counts. No matter who or what it comes from, the night stretches on, and you realize something striking. No one here expects to sleep through 8 uninterrupted hours. That idea belongs to your modern clock, not the Viking world. In the longhouse, rest came in pieces, often in shifts, as bodies rose and lay back down according to fire, chores, and the unpredictable rhythm of life. You stir at midnight, see someone poking at the embers, hear another rising to relieve themselves outside, and it dawns on you. Sleep was communal, but it was also staggered. Written sources and ethnographic comparisons suggest that pre-industrial sleep was often segmented. People dozed for a few hours, woke in the night, and then drifted into a second sleep before dawn. Some researchers argue that Vikings likely followed this pattern too. After all, tending the hearth required it. The fire had to be fed, smoke holes adjusted, animals checked. In the deep dark of Scandinavian winter, waking at odd intervals was part of survival. Picture it now. Around you, half the hall snores, while a few shadowy figures move quietly through the haze. One kneels at the fire, laying a log onto the embers. Another leads a goat outside, muttering into the cold. A third simply sits, wide-eyed, thinking or praying in the half-light. Sleep here isn't absolute. It's fluid, a tide ebbing and flowing through the night. One well-supported fact is that sagas occasionally described midnight moments as if characters were expected to be awake for a spell in the dark. Some stories even mention conversations or reflections taking place in the middle of the night, not treated as interruptions, but as natural pauses in the rhythm of rest. For the Viking family, nighttime was not a solid block of unconsciousness, but a shared, shifting landscape of dozing, waking, tending, and dreaming. And then comes a quirky image. A child waking in the dark, asking the parent to tell a story before drifting back to sleep. The sagas themselves might have been born in those in-between hours, when half the hall was awake, voices carrying low over the crackle of the fire. What better time to pass on tales of gods and heroes than in the hushed stillness between first and second sleep? Scholars, of course, argue about how consistent this practice was. Some insist segmented sleep was nearly universal before artificial lighting, while others caution that evidence is thin and often drawn from later sources. Did Vikings follow this rhythm every night, or only in winter when darkness stretched endlessly? The truth lies somewhere between certainty and speculation, but the patterns of fire tending and livestock care suggest strong possibilities. Now imagine yourself stirring from a dream. Your body is warm under furs, but your lungs ache from smoke. You cough, sit up, and see someone else already awake. There's comfort in that, the shared acknowledgement that the night isn't something to conquer alone. You toss on another log, perhaps mutter a few words to a god or ancestor, then ease back down, waiting for the tide of sleep to return. This rhythm also meant that Viking nights were not silent stretches but punctuated with life. The scrape of wood on fire, the creak of benches as someone shifts, the sighs of animals rising and settling again. Even the act of stepping outside into the cold for relief broke the monotony, your eyes meeting the aurora swirling above before you scurried back inside. These interruptions stitched themselves into memory, making each night a woven fabric rather than a blank dot. Think for a moment about how this altered the experience of time. In the Longhouse, the dark was not a void to be endured, but a canvas stretched across shifting hours. People moved in and out of wakefulness like fish in a current. Perhaps that explains why the Vikings measured their days less by minutes and more by tasks. Feed the animals, stoke the fire, share a tale, drift to sleep again. And so you settle into that rhythm yourself. First sleep, waking moments, second sleep. You breathe with the hall, rising and falling with its pulse. The modern idea of one solid, private, quiet night dissolves. In its place is a communal tide, a cycle of warmth, watchfulness, and dreams broken into pieces but still somehow whole. The night grows deeper, and though your body rests, your ears stay awake. In this crowded longhouse, silence never truly arrives. Instead, the air is thick with overlapping sounds, a chorus of human and animal life echoing through the smoky beams. You hear it all: songs, mutters, snores, the creak of timbers, the cough of someone whose lungs are filled with soot. For a Viking, this was the soundtrack of sleep. Archaeologists can't excavate sound, but sagas and ethnographic parallels offer clues. Imagine after the evening meal, as families began to settle down, someone might recite a verse or a saga fragment, letting the words carry into the dark. These weren't formal performances. They were bedtime habits, ways of filling the hours before the first wave of sleep. A chieftain's hall might echo with tales of Odin, Thor, or local heroes, while a farmer's house might hum with lullabies whispered to restless children. Either way, stories and songs were stitched into the night as firmly as the straw beneath your back. But once voices faded, another sound rose, snoring. Picture dozens of bodies packed together on benches, cloaks pulled tight, airways clogged with smoke and fatigue. The cacophony must have been extraordinary. Some ethnographies studying traditional farmhouses in Scandinavia describe them as barns of sound where no one ever truly slept in silence. You lie there now, pressed between relatives, and the snores shake your ear as loudly as the storm outside. Here's a curious aside. Some sagas even joke about loud sleepers. Characters are mocked for the thunderous sounds they made at night, as if everyone in the hall was doomed to share the misery. Humor survives precisely because it was so common. Snoring was unavoidable in a room crammed with exhausted bodies and poor air circulation. Imagine muttering curses at your neighbor's rattling throat while knowing you did the same. When you drifted off dot, and then there were the animals. Cows shifting in their stalls, goats bleating softly, pigs grunting in dreams. Every noise amplified in the echoing timber shell. Some scholars suggest this constant background of animal sounds may have been oddly comforting, proof that the creatures, the family's wealth and lifeblood, were safe for the night. Others propose it was maddening, an unending reminder that you were living in a barn as much as a house. Both views ring true, depending on your tolerance. Now think about the fire again. As logs burned down, they popped and hissed, sending sparks snapping into the gloom. The hearth itself was noisy, a restless companion that never let the room fully quiet. Sometimes the shift of logs would wake a light sleeper, who in turn would stir others. The sound chain rippled through the hall, keeping night perpetually restless. Modern readers often imagine sleep as a private, serene escape, but for Vikings, it was something else entirely. Sleep was social. You slept in a soundscape woven from every voice, every cough, every animal breath. Privacy was a dream, drowned beneath the steady hum of life packed into timber walls. Did people find it exhausting? Or, having never known silence, did they drift into slumber with ease, their minds soothed by the familiarity of shared sound? One thing is certain, sagas often describe evenings filled with speech. Heroes exchange boasts, women sing, children listen. That suggests that noise wasn't only tolerated. It was expected, part of the rhythm of domestic life. The shift from spoken tales to snores was seamless, a continuum of voices passing from conscious to unconscious. You might smile at the idea that the same lungs which sang praises to Thor an hour ago now rumbled like a bull in slumber. Scholars continue to discuss how these constant sounds shaped the culture. Some argue it fostered resilience. If you can sleep through goats bleating and uncles snoring, you can endure anything. Others propose it heightened storytelling traditions. With so much time awake in the dark, tales became central to community identity. The evidence leaves space for both interpretations, and as you listen in the Longhouse, you sense both are true. Now let your ears fill with that imagined chorus, the rhythm of breathing, the creak of the roof, the occasional cry of a child, the deep bass of a cow settling down. Together, these sounds weave a lullaby, harsh perhaps, but comforting in its familiarity. You realize that for a Viking, sleep wasn't escape from the world. It was immersion in it, a nightly surrender to the noisy, smoky, beating heart of the Longhouse. The hours crawl on, And you realize warmth isn't only about fire, furs, or bodies pressed close. It also comes from within, from what you eat before lying down. The Viking diet was heavy with grains, meat, and dairy, all dense foods that stoked the furnace of the body. A stomach filled with porridge or roasted mutton generated a slow burn of energy that carried you through the night. Without it, you'd shiver even under the thickest reindeer hide. Archaeological studies of Viking latrines and rubbish heaps paint a clear picture of what sustained these nights. Barley and rye bread, thick soups of peas and beans, stews of lamb or pork, and the ever-present dairy products from cows and goats. These foods weren't just nourishment. They were insulation in edible form. You can almost taste a bowl of barley gruel sweetened with honey, heavy in the belly, warming you as you curl on your straw bedding. And here's a curious little detail. Bones unearthed from Viking sites sometimes show gnaw marks, suggesting that marrow was a prized midnight snack. Imagine a child crunching on a roasted bone before bed, greasy fingers tucked into furs afterward. Not glamorous, but practical. The fat provided concentrated calories, fueling warmth long after the fire burned low. What researchers still puzzle over is how evenly such foods were distributed. Did wealthier families enjoy richer, meat-heavy diets, while poorer households scraped by on grains and thin soups? The evidence hints at disparity. Some graves yield traces of rich animal proteins, others mostly plant-based diets, which means that one family might fall asleep stuffed and warm, while another went to bed hungry and cold in the very same village. The impact of diet on sleep is something you can feel as you imagine yourself here. With a full belly, your body relaxes, limbs heavy, warmth radiating from within. Without food, the cold bites deeper, every draft as sharp as a sting. It's no wonder that winter feasts, often timed around Yule, were such important events. They weren't just celebrations. They were survival strategies, filling bellies at the coldest time of year. Picture the scene. After a hearty stew simmered all evening in the central hearth, families settle onto their benches, bellies stretched, warmth spreading through their cores. The smoky longhouse may still be drafty, but their inner fires glow. Even the animals benefit, fed hay and scraps. Their own bellies churn with warmth, adding to the hall's collective heat. Sleep arrives easier when hunger isn't gnawing at your ribs. Another quirky tidbit comes from saga literature. Heroes are sometimes described as eating enormous meals before resting, as if sheer appetite were a mark of strength. One tale mentions a man devouring whole sides of meat before falling into a snoring heap. Was it exaggeration? Almost certainly. But it reflects a cultural truth that eating well meant sleeping well, and both were signs of health and vitality. Yet historians still disagree about the extent to which diet mitigated the cold. Some argue that calorie-dense foods were essential in the subarctic climate, functioning as internal insulation. Others suggest that while diet played a role, clothing and bedding mattered far more, pointing out that even the best-fed body couldn't withstand icy drafts without wool and fur. The debate remains unresolved, and you're left to weigh both perspectives while chewing on your imaginary barley loaf. The sensory picture is vivid, the aftertaste of smoky stew lingering on your tongue, the heaviness in your belly, the way warmth spreads from core to fingertips. You curl into your furs, shift against your neighbor, and sigh. Tonight, food is as much a blanket as the hides pulled over your shoulders. In the Viking world, survival wasn't just about what covered you. It was about what filled you. And as the night drifts on, you understand that each bite of stew, each gulp of milk, Each sliver of marrow was a thread in the fabric of warmth, woven into the longhouse as surely as logs and turf. Your belly is heavy from that smoky stew, and now someone passes you a horn brimming with ale. The warmth of food is one thing, but the warmth of drink is another. Vikings brewed beer, ale, and mead, and these weren't just for feasting. They slipped into the rhythms of everyday life, even the nightly struggle to keep warm. One swallow sends a flush to your cheeks, a trickle of heat spreading through your chest. For a moment, you feel as though the cold has been banished entirely. Archaeological finds of brewing vats, fermentation pits, and residue on clay vessels confirm that alcohol was a constant presence in Viking homes. Ale brewed from barley or oats, flavored with herbs, was common. Mead, the honey wine of legend, may have been rarer but highly prized. These drinks were caloric, mildly intoxicating, and above all, warming. The sensation of warmth, though fleeting, was enough to help families drift off under their smoky roofs. And yet, there's a strange contradiction you can sense even now. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, making you feel warm on the surface, but it also hastens heat loss. Modern medicine tells us that drinking before bed in a freezing hall could be dangerous. Did the Vikings know this? Probably not in scientific terms, but they must have noticed the effects. Some waking sweaty, others shivering more after a drink. Still, in a world of cold nights, the immediate comfort outweighed the long-term risk. One charming aside comes from sagas, where men, having drunk too heavily, fell asleep in awkward places, sometimes on benches, sometimes even near the fire. Imagine being roused at midnight to drag a tipsy uncle away from smoldering embers, before his cloak caught flame. Humor preserved in story hints that this happened often enough to be worth retelling, but alcohol wasn't merely about indulgence. These drinks carried calories, important when every scrap of energy mattered. A horn of ale could be as filling as a small meal, helping to sustain warmth from within. Honeyed mead, sweet and heavy, was almost like syrup, giving the body quick-burning fuel. You imagine lying down after such a drink, warmth coursing through you, dreams drifting quicker to the surface. Specialists still differ on how widely alcohol was consumed nightly. Some argue that ale was the daily drink, replacing water that was often unsafe. Others caution that brewing required grain and honey, both valuable, so households may have rationed carefully. Which is true? The archaeological record suggests both extremes were possible. Feasting halls where mead flowed freely, and small farms where ale was precious, consumed sparingly on winter nights. The sensory impression is vivid. The tang of fermented barley on your tongue, the sweetness of honey lingering on your lips, the slight dizziness as you lie back against your furs. Around you, voices grow louder, laughter rises, then slowly fades into snores. The alcohol turns the noisy hall into a softer blur, making the press of bodies and the sting of smoke feel more bearable. Yet the risks remained. A drink too many, and you might oversleep your turn tending the fire. Worse, you might stumble into the animal stalls or collapse dangerously close to the hearth. Folklore even preserves warnings about drinking too deeply before bed, stories meant to remind that indulgence could end in disaster. So as you settle beneath your cloak, warmed by both stew and mead, you recognize the double-edged nature of Viking drink. It comforted, it sustained, and it lulled, but it also left you vulnerable in the coldest nights. You drift into dreams, cheeks flushed, belly full, thinking that survival sometimes tastes like barley and honey, sharp and sweet on the tongue. Your head still swims faintly from that horn of mead, but as you roll onto your side, you notice something simple and telling. The woolen cloak you wore during the day has not been folded neatly away. It lies across you now, doubled as a blanket. In the Viking world, clothes were not mere garments. They were armor against the cold, by day and by night. When the fire faded and the longhouse groaned under snow, cloaks and tunics did double duty as bedding. The archaeological record is rich with textiles. Fragments of woolen cloth have been unearthed from graves and bogs across Scandinavia, often surprisingly well preserved. Thick twill weaves, tablet-woven bands, and coarse, homespun cloth show the dominance of wool in everyday life. Sheep were central to survival, not only for meat and milk, but for fleece that could be spun into endlessly useful fabric. Historians agree on this point. Without wool, Viking nights would have been much harsher. Wool had a particular magic quality. Its fibers trapped heat even when damp, a lifesaver in a climate where snow melted into every crack and clothing often got wet. Imagine pulling your day cloak tighter over your body, its rough texture scratching but also sealing in precious warmth. These cloaks weren't decorative in the way later medieval fashions became. They were practical slabs of fabric, pinned at the shoulder with brooches, heavy enough to resist the wind outside, and thick enough to serve as a coverlet inside. There's an intriguing side note here. In some graves, especially of higher status individuals, cloaks were found lined with imported furs. This suggests a layering system even in clothing. Wool on the outside for durability, fur on the inside for insulation. To sleep under such a cloak was to wrap yourself in both local craft and global trade, proof that fashion and survival walked hand in hand. You picture yourself pulling such a cloak over your shoulders, the wool scratchy against your chin, the fur lining warm against your skin. But what about ordinary people? Did every farmer or thrall have such luxury? Scholars still debate the distribution of clothing quality. Some argue that wool cloaks were universal, though the weave and thickness varied. Others insist that the best textiles were reserved for the wealthy, while poorer folk slept under thinner, rougher cloth, supplementing with straw or skins. The evidence doesn't fully resolve this, leaving you to imagine the range, from rich chieftains cocooned in layered cloaks to servants shivering beneath thin, threadbare wraps. Beyond cloaks, tunics and trousers often stayed on through the night. The idea of changing into nightclothes didn't exist. Instead, day garments became sleepwear, conserving every scrap of warmth. Archaeological textile finds show heavy wool tunics, sometimes belted, sometimes simple pullovers, which would have doubled as pajamas, whether intended or not. Think of sleeping fully dressed, boots off but everything else intact. As much a defense against drafts as a matter of convenience. One quirky piece of folklore suggests that women sometimes spread their shawls or headscarves over children as extra layers. Imagine a mother loosening her woven head wrap at night, laying it gently across her toddler as an impromptu blanket. These improvisations remind you that survival wasn't about luxury. It was about using every scrap of cloth available. Now close your eyes and feel the sensory side. Wool scratches at your neck, heavy across your chest, the faint smell of lanolin still clinging. Your tunic itches against your arms, but the warmth it holds is undeniable. The cloak above you blocks the chill that seeps through cracks in the turf walls, and for a while you breathe easier. Grateful for the stubborn heat of sheep's fleece, the social meaning of cloaks also lingered in the dark. To be given a cloak was a gift of protection, status, even intimacy. Sagas sometimes describe warriors gifting cloaks to companions, gestures that carried weight far beyond fabric. In a longhouse setting, that same cloak might later be shared as bedding, weaving together layers of symbolism, loyalty, survival, warmth. You wonder if someone lying beside you once wore their cloak in battle, and now it covers you in slumber. Historians continue to puzzle over how often clothing was washed. Some evidence suggests rarely, since wool retained oils that repelled water and dirt. That means the cloak warming you at night might smell strongly of smoke, sweat, and lanolin. Yet for the Vikings, this was familiar, even comforting. The scent wasn't filth. It was home, survival wrapped into every fiber. Consider also the rhythm of reuse. The same cloak might serve at a feast by day, draped proudly over shoulders, then become a blanket by night, shared among children. Fabric was never wasted. It was too valuable. Even worn, threadbare pieces found new lives as padding, patches, or stuffing for bedding. Every scrap contributed to the nightly war against cold. The image becomes clear. The Viking longhouse wasn't furnished with piles of purpose-made blankets. It was filled with multi-purpose fabric, garments that crossed roles seamlessly. A cloak pinned at the shoulder during the day was unpinned and laid across your chest at night. A tunic that smelled of sweat and smoke kept you alive when the fire dwindled. The line between clothing and bedding blurred until it disappeared entirely. And so you settle deeper, the wool pressing down, the fur edges brushing your chin. You don't think of luxury. You think of endurance. Each fiber whispers of sheep grazing in summer fields, of women spinning by firelight, of looms creaking in smoky halls. Every thread is survival made tangible, and as you drift toward dreams you realize, in the Viking world, warmth didn't come from bed sheets tucked fresh and clean. It came from the very clothes you lived in, day and night, woven tight against the cold. You blink awake in the dim glow of embers and feel a little body pressed firmly against your side. It isn't an accident. Children in the Viking world were often placed in the middle of the bed, not only for comfort, but as a deliberate survival tactic. The smallest bodies, the most vulnerable to the creeping cold, were tucked between adults, insulated by layers of warmth on either side. It was the longhouse equivalent of central heating, positioning children like glowing coals, kept alive by the fire of family. Excavations of Viking graves, where children are sometimes found buried alongside adults with shared bedding goods, echo this practice. It wasn't just symbolic. It mirrored the way they had slept in life, intertwined, protected, guarded by the heat of older, stronger bodies. Archaeologists reading the soil stains of decomposed wood and fur can see the layout. Benches broad enough for several sleepers, with smaller imprints nestled between. It paints a picture not of privacy, but of survival through proximity. Close your eyes and imagine it now. Your child curls into your chest, hair smelling of smoke and wool, their small hands tucked under your cloak. On the other side, another child leans against your partner, legs pressed against yours. The adults form a protective cocoon, a living wall against drafts. Any modern parent would recognize the instinct to keep little ones close, but here it was magnified by necessity. Without that human insulation, a child might not last the night. One solid piece of evidence comes from saga literature, which occasionally hints at the middle place of children in bed-sharing arrangements. While these accounts are rare and indirect, they reinforce the archaeological clues. Vikings knew the cold was merciless, and they stacked the odds by stacking their families together. And then there's the quirky note from later Scandinavian folk practices. In some regions, children were said to sleep crosswise, lying perpendicular to the adults, so that many small bodies could be wedged into one bench. Picture that tangle of limbs, a row of adults stretched lengthwise, children nestled across them like bars in a fence. It sounds chaotic, but it maximized warmth, turning a wooden platform into a woven grid of heat. Historians don't all agree on how systematic this practice was. Some argue that saga hints and folk customs show a long continuity, that families always used the middle child method. Others caution that it may have varied widely, with some households practicing more separation, especially if benches were wide. The evidence is patchy, and debate lingers in academic halls. But in the smoky longhouse, with drafts curling under turf walls, the logic seems undeniable. You can feel it even now. The cold bites less when bodies pile close. Now think about the emotional side of this. Children drifting into sleep with the heartbeat of a parent in their ear, lulled by the combined warmth of family. Adults resting easier knowing their little ones were shielded, not just by furs, but by flesh and blood protection. In a world where childhood mortality was high, that kind of nightly intimacy must have carried deep reassurance. Yet comfort didn't erase discomfort. You shift under your cloak, and a child's knee jabs your ribs. Another tosses in their sleep, smacking your nose. The benches were narrow, the space crowded, and peace was constantly punctured by elbows and snores. Still, parents accepted it, because the alternative, letting a child sleep at the edge, exposed to drafts, was unthinkable. One odd discovery at a burial site in Norway revealed a child interred with a miniature fur blanket, carefully folded. Was it symbolic? Was it a representation of the family's nightly habit of covering children more carefully? We can't know for certain, but it hints that bedding for the young carried particular importance, both practical and spiritual. To keep a child warm was to keep the family line alive. The sensory picture sharpens as you place yourself there. You feel the weight of furs pressing down, the twitching warmth of a child's body against yours, the steady exhalations creating a small pocket of shared breath under the covers. It is stifling at times, damp with sweat and heavy with smell, yet also comforting, a cocoon against the freezing dark outside. From a social perspective, these arrangements wove families into tighter bonds. Modern ideas of separate nurseries or children's rooms didn't exist. Sleep was a shared endeavor, and in that closeness, love and dependence deepened. But so did the awareness of fragility. You can imagine a parent lying awake, hand resting on a child's chest to feel the rise and fall of breath, whispering a silent plea to the gods that this night, at least, would end with everyone alive. Scholarly debate lingers over whether such intimate bed-sharing shaped Viking parenting styles. Some anthropologists suggest it created stronger intergenerational bonds, with grandparents, parents, and children all pressed together each night. Others argue it may have fueled tension, with lack of rest making tempers short. Either way, the architecture forced intimacy, and the cold enforced it further. Now let your mind sink fully into this picture. The bench creaks under the combined weight of your family. Children stir, adults adjust, cloaks rustle. The fire hisses as someone stirs it awake, and briefly the glow illuminates faces in the heap. Flushed, sweaty, exhausted, but alive. That's the truth of Viking nights. They weren't serene escapes from hardship. They were battles fought with warmth, bodies, and bonds, every single dusk until dawn. And so, as your eyes close again in this imagined hall, you accept the discomfort because you understand its purpose. Children in the middle, adults on the edge, it's a geometry of survival. a nightly pattern written into benches and bedding alike. When morning comes and frost still bites the world outside, you'll rise knowing that huddling together made all the difference. The Longhouse is restless again, but this time the sounds carry a softer rhythm, murmurs, whispered laughter, the rustle of cloaks drawn tighter. You realize intimacy itself was part of surviving cold nights. Love and marriage in the Viking Age weren't just social arrangements. They were nightly contracts of warmth. To lie beside a partner wasn't only about companionship. It was a physical buffer against freezing drafts. Archaeological finds don't preserve affection, but they do reveal shared graves where couples were buried with bedding goods, cloaks or furs draped over them. This material evidence, alongside saga references, suggests that sleep and partnership were entwined. Marriage wasn't just about lineage or inheritance. In the dead of winter, it was about having someone to press against when the fire burned low. You pull your imaginary cloak tighter and feel the warmth of another body next to yours. The cold bites less sharply. In a hall where privacy was scarce, couples carved intimacy in whispers under shared furs. Was it comfortable? Perhaps not. Children snoring nearby, goats shifting in their pen, the smoke stinging eyes. But it was the only pocket of closeness to be found. One well-established detail from saga literature is the emphasis on the marriage bed as a place of negotiation and alliance. The Icelandic sagas sometimes mention who shared beds with whom, not just in the literal sense, but in the sense of honor and household order. That placement mattered. It dictated who was allowed into warmth, who lay beside the fire, and who was pushed toward the drafty edges. And here's a quirky little note. In some traditions, the wedding ceremony itself involved leading the bride to the marital bench inside the longhouse, rather than to a separate room. Imagine the whole household watching as the new couple's sleeping place was formally established, with everyone fully aware that the same bench would later double as their shared blanket against the cold. Romantic privacy wasn't the point. Practical survival was. Scholars remain divided on how much privacy Viking couples could actually achieve. Some argue that the crowded conditions left little room for seclusion, suggesting that intimacy was woven openly into the fabric of community life. Others counter that partitions or hangings, animal skins strung along beams, might have offered a little separation. The truth likely varied, with some halls allowing small nooks while others left couples entirely exposed to the gaze and ears of kin. The sensory picture is easy to conjure. You and your partner curl tightly together, sharing not only warmth but breath. Your cloaks overlap, your limbs tangle, and between snores and coughs you whisper words no one else hears. Around you, life in the longhouse rumbles on, but in this cocoon, you create a pocket of heat, physical and emotional. There's a tenderness here, even amid hardship. Imagine a farmer pressing his rough wool cloak over both himself and his wife, ensuring she's covered before he closes his own eyes. Or picture a woman tugging her fur closer around her husband after he stirred the fire, rewarding his vigilance with warmth. These gestures, small nightly acts, were as essential as any great saga deed, for they carried the family through winters that would have crushed them alone. But intimacy wasn't limited to spouses. In households where widows, widowers, or unmarried adults lived, bed sharing often stretched beyond the bounds of romance. Companionship and sleep could cross lines of kinship and duty. An elderly grandmother might sleep beside a granddaughter, not because of sentiment alone, but because body heat kept both alive. A servant might be folded into the same bench as children, filling gaps in the wall of warmth. The arrangement blurred boundaries, emphasizing that survival required cooperation above propriety. One peculiar tidbit lingers in medieval Christian sources, criticizing northern peoples. Some clerics grumbled that they lie all together in their huts with no separation of man and woman. While likely exaggerated, such commentary hints at a reality that shocked outsiders. Viking intimacy wasn't privatized behind stone walls. It was audible, visible, and part of the shared experience of the hall. For the Vikings themselves, this lack of seclusion may have bred resilience. Couples learned to treasure quiet moments, to find warmth not in isolation but amid the thrum of communal life. Love had to coexist with goats bleating and children shifting restlessly nearby. Perhaps that made it more enduring, less dependent on setting, and more rooted in presence. Specialists still question how this environment shaped Viking concepts of marriage and family. Did constant visibility enforce loyalty and transparency, or did it foster jealousy and tension? The sagas provide glimpses of both. Stories of devoted couples surviving hardship together, and tales of betrayal whispered in the same smoky dark. The ambiguity is fitting, for the Longhouse was both shelter and pressure cooker, magnifying every bond and every fracture. Now imagine yourself lying there. Cloaks overlapped, the weight of furs pressing you close. The smoke prickles your eyes. Children cough nearby. But your partner's hand brushes against yours, and for a moment, the cold doesn't matter. Intimacy in this world is measured not in roses or candlelight, but in shared warmth, whispered words, and the simple act of holding on through the night. In the end, that's what love looked like in the Viking Longhouse. Not grand gestures, but the nightly ritual of sharing heat, shielding each other from drafts, and finding connection in the crowded, smoky dark. Survival was communal, yes, but within that crowd, couples still carved their own fragile circle of warmth. The fire has quieted again, and you shift on the bench, feeling the prickly weight of straw beneath you. That's when you notice another nightly ritual that mattered more than anyone admitted, refreshing the bedding itself. Straw mattresses weren't permanent. They were renewed, fluffed, and sometimes replaced altogether. Without that effort, the simple material under your back would rot, flatten, and crawl with pests. Keeping straw fresh wasn't just comfort. It was hygiene, survival, and a bit of household pride. Archaeological digs have uncovered thick layers of straw mixed with ashen fragments of animal hair in longhouse floors. These are the remnants of bedding, spread in layers and refreshed seasonally. Straw insulated against the damp earth, gave a little cushioning, and absorbed some of the smoke and grease of daily life. But it had to be changed. Left too long, it became a foul mattress of mold, fleas, and filth. Imagine lying in straw so old it smelled sour, damp with sweat and spilled mead. That would hardly make sleep easier. One reliable point from medieval sources outside Scandinavia is the phrase, "shake down the bed." This meant fluffing straw bedding, shaking it out, and layering in fresh stalks. Viking households likely did the same, though with less ceremony. You picture a woman in late autumn dragging in bundles of straw, spreading them across the benches, and laughing grimly that these golden stalks would be brown and broken by spring. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some northern traditions that survived well into the modern era, fresh straw was laid in sleeping places at midwinter festivals. It wasn't just practical. It was symbolic, a gesture of renewal. To lie on new straw at Yule meant welcoming the turning of the year, inviting good fortune, while also ensuring the next few months of sleep weren't unbearably itchy. Was this custom Viking in origin? Scholars can't prove it, but the echoes are tantalizing. Now let your senses take over. You roll across straw that crinkles, stiff stalks poking your arms. The smell of dry grass, faintly sweet, under the heavier musk of furs. Fresh straw has a comfort all its own. Earthy, rustic, clean compared to the sour stench of old bedding. It rustles when you move, sounding almost like whispers in the dark. A small reminder that you're sleeping on the same stuff your animals chew. Yet even with this care, the straw never lasted long. Families likely replaced it multiple times a year whenever infestation became unbearable. Archaeologists have found layers of ash deliberately scattered in bedding areas, likely as an attempt to kill pests or dry out dampness. Imagine sprinkling ashes from the hearth across your bed before adding new straw. A strange kind of housekeeping that blurred the line between filth and remedy. Scholars continue to debate whether straw bedding was universal in longhouses or if wealthier households used alternatives like down or imported textiles. A handful of elite burials include feathers and finer fillings, suggesting some luxury. But for the majority, straw was the staple. It was cheap, abundant, and at least for a while comfortable. Think of it as the mattress of the masses, one that scratched and rustled but kept you off the bare planks. The practice of refreshing straw also created a rhythm in household life. Children might be tasked with dragging bundles indoors, servants with spreading it evenly, elders with shaking out cloaks before laying them down again. Every part of the process was communal, another reminder that survival was never solitary. Keeping the beds livable was as important as tending the fire or feeding the animals. Neglect it, and everyone would itch, cough, and complain. Imagine the soundscape when the straw was new. Families settled in, the crinkling chorus of bodies lying down echoing across the hall. It would quiet over the weeks, flattening until only silence and dust remained, until fresh bundles arrived and the noise of rustling sleep filled the night again. Small as it seems, that rhythm marked time, tying daily life to seasonal cycles. Another odd layer. Pests were a constant enemy. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in straw bedding. In fact, entomologists studying remains from Viking Age graves have identified flea species preserved in burial textiles, proof that itching through the night was universal. You squirm now, imagining a Viking tossing under furs, not from cold, but from crawling bites. Straw refreshed the bed, yes, but it never eliminated the problem. The battle against pests was eternal. And so you roll onto your side, aware of the mixture beneath you, fresh stalks crackling, ashes drying the damp, and hidden insects waiting for darkness. It's uncomfortable, imperfect, but it's better than the alternative. To lie directly on planks or soil would invite worse cold, worse damp, worse pain in your bones. Straw was never glamorous, but it was enough to tip the balance toward survival. This nightly maintenance, refreshing straw, spreading furs, shaking out cloaks was as much a ritual as eating or praying. It was the small, constant labor of keeping life livable inside a smoky hall. And though you might itch and grumble, you also sigh with relief, because in the Viking longhouse, fresh straw was not luxury. It was hope that tonight you might sleep a little easier. You tug the cloak higher across your shoulders, but still you twitch and scratch. It isn't the straw this time. It's the uninvited guests living in your bedding. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the warmth of Viking longhouses, just as they did in nearly every pre-modern society. If the cold didn't disturb your rest, the itching certainly did. Survival in a smoky timber hall was never about perfect comfort. It was about enduring the constant nuisance of tiny creatures that lived closer to your skin than you'd prefer. Archaeologists have found direct proof of this irritation. Excavations of Viking graves where textile fragments survive often turn up fossilized flea remains or lice eggs clinging to hair. One study from York, once a Viking city, unearthed combs thick with headless and bedding layers rich in flea droppings. These were not isolated incidents. Pests were universal. Everyone scratched. Warriors, farmers, even chieftains lay down at night with fleas hopping across their furs. The Longhouse was warm enough for humans to live and warm enough for insects to thrive. Now close your eyes and imagine the sensation. You drift into sleep, only to be jolted awake by an itch at your ankle. You scratch, roll over, and another bite pricks your shoulder. The straw rustles as you shift again. Around you, others do the same, their small movements creating a restless ripple through the benches. The whole hall breathes, snores, coughs, and scratches. In some ways, fleas were the true chorus of Viking nights. Here's a curious detail that makes you smile grimly. Double-sided combs were among the most common personal items found in Viking burials. One side had wider teeth for grooming hair, the other fine teeth for catching lice. Imagine a family huddled around the fire in the evening, not just telling stories but also combing each other's heads, flicking lice into the flames. Hygiene rituals doubled as bonding time. Perhaps even laughter softened the frustration, one person teasing another for hosting a flea circus in their hair. But pests weren't only in hair. They lived in the very furs and blankets meant to protect you. Animal hides provided warmth, yes, but also perfect habitats for fleas. In winter, when bedding wasn't washed or replaced, infestations exploded. Some ethnographies studying later Scandinavian farmhouses noted that children joked about night fleas keeping them awake, suggesting that itching was accepted as part of life. Sleep meant enduring the tiny stings as much as the drafts through the turf. Specialists argue about how much these pests truly affected health. Some suggest the constant irritation led to skin infections or weakened sleep, making people more vulnerable to illness. Others believe that while annoying, the human body simply adapted and communities learned to live with it. The evidence is inconclusive, but the debate shows just how central these tiny creatures were to daily life. Think of the sensory world this created. The smell of smoke and wool clinging to your cloak, the heavy warmth of furs, the faint scratching sound of someone across the hall dragging nails against their skin. Even animals weren't immune. Cows and goats brought their own insects indoors, adding to the collective buzz. You might laugh in despair, realizing that the only creatures truly thriving in the Longhouse were the fleas. One odd archaeological note comes from deposits of ash sprinkled into bedding areas. Scholars speculate that ashes were used deliberately to dry out damp straw and to deter pests. Was it effective? Perhaps somewhat. You picture a mother tossing handfuls of gray dust over the bedding before layering fresh straw, hoping the grit would discourage fleas from nesting. It's a primitive insecticide, born of necessity. Yet there were other folk remedies too. Some later traditions speak of placing pungent herbs like tansy or juniper in bedding, both for smell and to repel insects. Did Vikings do the same? There's no direct evidence, but given their knowledge of local plants, it's entirely possible. Imagine falling asleep on straw laced with crushed juniper, the sharp scent mixing with smoke and damp fur. Did it help? Or just make the itch smell nicer? Historians remain unsure. The emotional toll can't be overlooked either. Nights were never entirely restful when pests stirred. Parents may have spent long hours calming children crying from itchy bites. Couples whispered curses at fleas bouncing under blankets. Even the toughened warriors who could face icy seas and battlefields must have groaned at the indignity of scratching like dogs through the night. Still, fleas and lice became part of identity. Combs were as necessary as swords, fireside delousing as common as storytelling. To be Viking was to be itchy, and to accept that discomfort as another battle waged daily. The cold, the smoke, the pests, none could be eliminated entirely, but all could be endured. So as you shift again under your furs, scratching your arm and sighing, you realize something deeper. The Viking night was a tapestry of imperfections. Warmth came wrapped in smoke, companionship came wrapped in noise, and bedding came crawling with fleas. Yet people still slept, still dreamed, still woke, ready to sail and farm and fight. Sleep was never about comfort. It was about endurance. And in enduring, the Vikings outlasted both the winter and the biting fleas that feasted in its shadow. The smoke curls thicker tonight, and as you lie beneath the hides, you sense something beyond the physical warmth. For the Vikings, sleep was never just a bodily need. It carried weight in the world of spirit and superstition. The hearth, the furs, even the straw beneath you were infused with meanings that went far deeper than insulation. Warmth itself was sacred, a gift that could be tied to gods, ancestors, and unseen guardians. Archaeological finds and saga passages hint at this invisible layer of Viking life. Small household shrines, carved figures, and traces of offerings near hearths suggest that the fire was more than fuel. It was the dwelling place of divine protectors. To tend the fire was to feed the spirit of the home. Each glowing ember symbolized life, not just heat. You imagine someone whispering a prayer as they laid a log onto the fire, asking Thor to shield the household from frost or calling on Freyr to watch over sleeping children. One well-attested point is the association of the hearth with *Landvitter, spirits of the land. These beings were thought to linger around houses, guarding them or punishing neglect. A family that kept the fire well fed and the hall orderly invited protection. A family that let the hearth go cold might face misfortune. In this way, survival rituals were also rituals of devotion. And then there's a charming little detail found in later Scandinavian folk traditions. People sometimes placed iron objects like knives or keys near children's bedding to ward off evil. Was this done in the Viking Age? The evidence is hazy, but it's easy to imagine a mother laying her child between herself and her husband, tucking a small iron amulet under the straw, and believing the metal would repel wandering spirits of frost or disease. Scholars are not unanimous on how formal these domestic beliefs were. Some argue they were everyday superstitions, passed quietly within families, never codified. Others think they were structured rituals woven into seasonal festivals like Yule, when bedding was refreshed and fires blessed. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle, a fluid mixture of practical acts and whispered prayers, unrecorded but deeply felt. The sensory world of this belief is vivid. Picture yourself lying on straw, the crackle of fire close, and hearing a grandmother murmur charms against frost spirits. The smoke becomes more than irritation. It is a shield. The furs feel heavier, not just with warmth but with meaning, as though ancestors themselves press close through the hides. The night becomes a blend of physical endurance and spiritual reassurance. One fascinating archaeological find comes from graves where bedding goods were included. children buried with tiny fur blankets, adults interred with cloaks or even whole bedding sets. Why take bedding into the afterlife unless warmth was believed to matter beyond death? To sleep eternally without furs or straw was unimaginable. This intertwining of survival and spirituality shows just how deeply the Vikings tied warmth to well-being, body and soul alike. Imagine, too, the role of dreams. In a smoky hall, half waking in the middle of segmented sleep, dreams would have felt vivid and strange. Sagas often described dream visions of ancestors or gods visiting in the night. Could the smoke and the flicker of fire have shaped these visions, making them seem more real? A Viking waking from such a dream might tell the hall in the morning that a spirit had spoken, advising on harvest or warning of danger. In this way, even restless nights became channels to the divine. And here's an odd note. Some scholars suggest that the oppressive environment smoke, pests, cramped space, may have heightened the spiritual dimension of night. Discomfort blurred the line between waking and dreaming, sharpening the sense that unseen beings hovered in the rafters. Did the Vikings see frost not merely as weather, but as a spirit pressing against the walls? Did every gust of cold air feel like a rival force to the glowing hearth? It's a debate that touches anthropology as much as history. Now place yourself in that mindset. You lie in your cloak, child pressed against you, and hear the fire hiss. You whisper a few words, not because you fully understand them, but because everyone does. The words are a shield, like the cloak, like the straw, like the walls. Your warmth is physical, yes, but also spiritual. You believe it keeps danger away, and in that belief lies comfort. The Viking night was never just a battle of cold against fire. It was a negotiation between human endurance and the unseen powers of the world. The Longhouse became a sanctuary, not just of wood and turf, but of spirit and song. Warmth was a gift, and gifts in that culture always implied reciprocity. You fed the fire, and in return it fed you. You honored the spirits, and in return they shielded you from frost's bite. So as you let your eyes close again in this imagined hall, the smoke thick around you, you sense more than discomfort. You sense the invisible company of gods and ancestors, hovering like shadows above the rafters, breathing warmth into the Longhouse. And you realize that to sleep in a Viking winter was not only to trust the fire and furs, but also to trust that unseen hands guarded the night. The Longhouse is quieted again, though not into silence. Embers glow low, shadows stretch long, and you notice a quiet ritual playing out by the fire. Someone crouches, stirring the coals, their hands dusted in gray powder. They aren't building a new blaze, not yet. They are tending to what already exists, coaxing it to last until dawn. Charcoal, ash, and embers. These were the Vikings' tools for stretching fire through the endless dark. Without them, every morning would mean the cold shock of starting from nothing. Archaeological remains of hearths often contain thick layers of ash, not just from burning, but from deliberate banking. Families scattered ash across glowing embers before sleeping, trapping heat under the powder. In the morning, the sleeper closest to the hearth could push the ash aside, revealing a faint red glow, then feed it with new wood. This method saved precious fuel and spared the misery of flint and tinder every morning. You picture yourself leaning over the hearth, ash smudging your face, carefully uncovering that tiny ember like a buried jewel. One established fact comes from later medieval sources. The practice of raking the fire into ash piles was common across Europe. Given the parallels, it's almost certain the Vikings did the same. The technology was simple yet effective, and in the North, every trick to preserve fire was cherished. Ash became a blanket for embers, and embers became a promise of survival. And here's an amusingly odd aside: ash wasn't just insulation. It also doubled as a cleaning agent. Households sometimes rubbed ash on greasy pots or even on hair as a primitive shampoo. Imagine crawling into bed with ash still under your fingernails, knowing it was the same substance keeping your hearth alive. In the Viking world, nothing was wasted, not even soot. Now, consider the sensory reality. The hearth at night was less a roaring blaze than a faint, glowing snake of coals, shifting red under its gray skin. You'd hear occasional pops as tiny sparks escaped their burial, see little threads of light weaving through the ash. The smell of char lingered, sharp in your nose, mixed with damp wool and fur. That faint warmth was enough to keep frost from biting too deep. To a Viking, those glowing coals were as precious as silver. Specialists remain divided on how many fires burned at once. Some believe longhouses had a single central hearth, carefully managed, while others argue for multiple smaller fires banked across the hall. Excavations in Greenland, for example, revealed several burned patches that may have been separate hearths. Was this redundancy in case one fire failed? Or was it simply the need to heat such enormous spaces? The evidence sparks ongoing discussion, leaving you to imagine both: a grand central blaze dimmed into embers, or scattered little hearths glowing faintly across the longhouse. Think too about the human responsibility behind this ritual. Someone always had to wake in the night to check the embers, push them together, add a pinch of fuel. It was a task passed quietly among household members, never formally assigned but always performed. Imagine a groggy man rising, his breath clouding, stumbling to the hearth to poke the ash. His mutterings join the chorus of snores before he falls back onto the bench. Job done. These half-asleep guardians kept warmth alive. There's another curious note from sagas. Occasionally fires are described as dying in the night, leaving households scrambling to rekindle flames from neighbors. In such cases, someone might trudge through the snow carrying a clay pot, coaxing it home before the ember cooled. To borrow fire was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that warmth itself was communal. Losing your hearth meant leaning on the goodwill of others. Another thread binding Viking villages together. Now imagine yourself at dawn. The hall is still dim, the fire banked low. You stir, teeth chattering, and shuffle toward the hearth. Ash crumbles under your fingers, and with a small thrill, you uncover the faint orange eye of an ember. Carefully you feed it twigs, then a branch. The glow brightens, smoke curls upward, and life rushes back into the hall. Around you, others stir, grateful you've spared them the cold shock of relighting from scratch. In that moment, you feel like you've carried a secret flame through the night, a bridge from dusk to morning. Scholars continue to ask, how much wood did these longhouses consume? Some estimate several tons each winter, an immense burden requiring constant chopping and hauling. The practice of banking embers under ash wasn't just convenience. It was necessity. Without it, fuel demands would have been unsustainable. Each ember preserved meant fewer trees felled, fewer hours with axe and saw. The emotional dimension of this practice shouldn't be overlooked. To wake in the dark and see that faint glow meant safety. The ember was proof the house was alive, the family still cradled in warmth. Its absence would have been terrifying, a symbol of vulnerability. You can almost hear the sigh of relief each morning as someone uncovered that stubborn glow. So you sink back into your bedding, picturing the ash-covered hearth. It may not roar, it may not dazzle, but its quiet endurance matters more than spectacle. For the Vikings, survival was less about blazing fires and more about keeping a tiny ember alive through the night. That ember was the heartbeat of the hall, glowing faintly beneath its gray cover, a promise that even in the coldest dark, dawn would not come to an extinguished world. The ember glows faintly in its ash bed, but not all Viking families relied solely on the hearth's long breath. Some experimented with tools and tricks to push the cold back further, introducing iron braziers and oil lamps into their smoky halls. These were not common luxuries. Iron was precious, oil even more so, but in certain households, they offered small, portable islands of warmth and light when the central fire faltered. Archaeologists excavating high-status Viking sites have uncovered fragments of metal braziers, shallow iron containers blackened by heat. These were filled with glowing coals and moved around the room, creating pockets of warmth wherever needed. Picture a weary woman setting one near her children's bedding, its faint red glow just enough to take the sting off the draft, creeping through the turf wall. Unlike the central hearth, which was fixed, these braziers were flexible, shifting warmth exactly where survival demanded it. Oil lamps to surface in the archaeological record. Small stone or clay bowls with blackened rims, their edges scorched by flame. Animal fat or fish oil filled them, with a simple wick drawing the liquid fire. These lamps gave light, yes, but they also gave a little heat, meager, flickering, but precious when every degree mattered. Imagine the faint smell of fish oil mingling with wood smoke, a child's eyes reflecting the trembling flame as stories continued deep into the night. One well-attested fact is that Norse settlers in Greenland and Iceland depended heavily on fish oil, lamps during the long winter months when wood was scarce. The practice may have trickled into wealthier Scandinavian households as well, where lamps supplemented hearths. The glow of oil wasn't bright enough to illuminate the hall fully, but it softened the oppressive darkness, making the longhouse feel less like a cave and more like a home. And then there's a peculiar little observation from experiments with reconstructed longhouses. Iron braziers often made the air worse. Moving hot coals around created more smoke and risked fire hazards. Some reenactors described coughing as they tested braziers in confined spaces, joking that Vikings must have either been tougher or more desperate than modern lungs could endure. You can almost see someone dragging a brazier too close to a straw mattress, sparks flying, curses shouted in the dark. Survival and danger were never far apart. Scholars remain divided on just how widespread these tools were. Some argue they were luxuries reserved for elites, chieftains' halls, or wealthy traders who could afford the iron and oil. Others believe they were more common, pointing to the simplicity of stone lamps and the occasional brazier fragment found even in modest farm sites. The disagreement lingers, but the archaeological fragments prove at least some families slept, with the comfort of auxiliary flames now focus on the sensory layer of it. A brazier hisses as a coal shifts inside, sending up a thin thread of smoke. The faint red glow illuminates faces around it, warm in a circle barely large enough for 2 or 3 sleepers. An oil lamp flickers, its flame guttering when a draft sneaks in, then steadying again. The smell of fish oil is pungent, heavy, clinging to wool and fur. But in that circle of dim light, fear of the dark recedes, and warmth creeps into stiff fingers. Oddly enough, some later folklore describes people believing lamps held protective power. A flame kept burning all night was thought to repel spirits and wandering souls. Was this belief already present in the Viking Age? The evidence is thin, but the continuity of practice suggests it may have been. Imagine a family unwilling to let the lamp die, not only for light, but because its flame kept frost spirits at bay. In a world of drafty walls and long nights, that faith may have been as important as the heat itself. From a practical standpoint, braziers and lamps show the Viking willingness to experiment with technology. They didn't settle for just one strategy. They layered solutions. Fire at the center, coals in a brazier, oil in a lamp, furs over bodies, all together creating a web of defenses against the endless winter. Each solution carried risks, but together they pushed back the frost just far enough. Think of the emotional impact too. For a child lying awake in the smoky dark, a tiny oil lamp might have been more comforting than the vast hearth. The big fire smoked and roared. The lamp glowed softly, like a personal guardian. To fall asleep in its light was to feel watched over, even when drafts howled and goats snorted nearby. So as you drift into this picture, you see the Viking longhouse not as a monolithic hall of smoke, but as a patchwork of glowing hearts. The hearth at the center, the brazier glowing by the bench, the lamp flickering near the door. Each flame held back darkness in its own way, each spark a reminder that survival came not from one grand solution, but from dozens of small, fragile fires tended through the night. And when morning finally came, the embers, the lamps, and the braziers alike reminded everyone that they had endured yet another winter's night. It was never comfortable, never luxurious, but it was enough. And enough in the Viking Age was everything. The longhouse groans in the wind again, and you run your hand along the wall. The timber feels rough, heavy, and solid. But it isn't just wood. It's clever carpentry, a kind of insulation borrowed from another Viking talent, shipbuilding. These people weren't only farmers and raiders. They were master craftsmen of the sea, and some of the tricks they used to keep water out of their ships also helped them keep cold out of their homes. Archaeologists studying longhouse remains often remark on the ship-like qualities of the structures. The walls sloped inward, like the hull of a vessel, making them more stable against storms and snow. The roofs, layered with overlapping turf sods, resembled the way planks overlap in a longship, each piece shedding water from the next. It's a kind of design echo, as if every Viking carried the sea home with them in the very shape of their dwelling. One well-supported detail comes from Greenland, where settlers built homes with double walls, an inner timber frame and an outer turf layer, packed tightly with earth and sometimes even seaweed. The seaweed acted like insulation, filling gaps and holding in warmth. Imagine the crackle of dried kelp stuffed between logs, an unlikely but effective barrier against the icy air. Shipbuilders, too, stuffed fibers, oakum, moss, animal hair, between planks to keep water out. The same principle, applied to houses, kept the wind from slicing through. And here's a quirky little note. Some longhouses may have used recycled ship timbers in their construction. Wood was precious in Scandinavia, and when a ship grew too old to sail, its sturdy oak ribs could be repurposed into the frame of a house. You might be sleeping beneath beams that once crossed the North Sea, creaking with waves before they creaked with winter storms. Specialists still debate how deliberately these shipbuilding methods influenced architecture. Some argue the similarities are just coincidence, practical solutions that emerged separately. Others insist the parallels are too strong to ignore, that shipwrights consciously applied their skills to houses. The evidence remains fragmentary, leaving the question unresolved. But the idea is tempting. The sea and the hearth built from the same logic. Close your eyes and imagine the sensory feel of these ship-like walls. The inward slope makes the hall feel like a sheltering hull, embracing you in its frame. Snow slides off the turf roof the way water slides off a deck. You hear the timbers groan under wind like planks under a wave. The longhouse becomes not just a house, but a beached ship, carrying its crew through winter instead of across oceans. Another fascinating connection lies in caulking. Viking ships were famously sealed with tar and resin to keep them watertight. Some evidence suggests similar sealants were smeared into gaps of house timbers to block drafts. Imagine the sharp, piney smell of tar mixing with smoke and wool inside the hall. For modern noses, it would be harsh. For the Vikings, it was probably the smell of safety. The same scent that kept ships afloat also kept children from freezing. And then there's the matter of ventilation. Ships needed air to keep below decks livable, and houses needed airflow to let smoke escape. Some longhouse reconstructions show vents angled like hatches, designed to be opened or closed depending on wind. Was this seafaring logic brought ashore? Scholars debate it, but the parallels remain striking. A Viking shipwright may have looked at a smoke hole in the roof and thought of it as just another hatch, another balance between air and enclosure. Think also about the symbolic layer. For a seafaring culture, the ship was more than transport. It was identity, prestige, and myth. To build homes with echoes of ships may not have been purely practical. It may have been cultural, a way of tying daily life to the sea. You can imagine a Viking farmer pointing proudly at his turf-roofed hall and saying, half joking, "This house sails through winter." Now consider the experience of lying inside such a structure. The turf roof muffles the wind, the double walls hold back the draft, and the whole place feels sturdier than a simple wooden shack. You may still cough from smoke, itch from fleas, and jostle against neighbors, but you also feel secure. The house is more than wood and earth. It's the work of craftsmen who knew how to bend nature to human need. Scholars remain divided on whether this ship logic was conscious design or cultural overlap. Some say builders simply applied whatever knowledge they had. Others propose that the seafaring mindset infused everything, so that even homes reflected the same worldview. Either way, the result was undeniable. Longhouses that could endure storms like ships endured waves. So as you press your palm against the timber wall, you feel its grain, smell its tar, and hear it creak. You realize you are inside a vessel, not for water, but for winter. A ship built not to sail seas, but to survive nights. And in that recognition, you understand the quiet genius of Viking adaptation. The same hands that carved dragon-headed prows also built halls, where families huddled through endless cold. The fire pops softly, and above it, words ripple through the smoky air. Even in exhaustion, voices carry stories, and these stories leave clues. When archaeologists and historians look for evidence of how Vikings actually slept, they don't only turn to ruins or artifacts. They also lean on sagas, Eddic poems, and scraps of medieval writing. These texts, half history and half myth, whisper about nights in the longhouse, sometimes casually, as if sleep were just another backdrop to the drama of life. One clear detail: saga authors often mention the asterisk Eldhus asterisk, or asterisk Scully asterisk, hearth house, describing characters lying by the fire or turning in on benches. These simple phrases confirm what ruins already show, that benches lined the walls and people lay beside the central blaze. They also reveal how ordinary the arrangement was. There's no flourish, no marvel, just a casual note. Of course, people slept in smoky halls. It was so normal it needed no explanation. But every so often, sagas give us a sharper glimpse. In *Erbygja Saga*, for example, there's mention of gatherings where people sat up late around the fire, talking and listening to tales before finally laying down on their benches. You can picture it, a hall buzzing with laughter, boasting, gossip, and then slowly bodies settling under cloaks, the noise fading into snores. It's the rhythm of night, preserved in narrative. And here's a curious little fragment. In some poetic verses, heroes are described as sleeping with weapons by their side. Archaeologists back this up, having found swords and spears in burials where the dead were laid out as if ready to rise again. In daily life, this might mean that warriors indeed kept arms close even in bed, just in case raiders or enemies struck at night. Imagine lying on straw, furs pulled high, one hand resting on your sword hilt, comfort and vigilance side by side. Scholars disagree, though, on how literally to take these descriptions. Were they reflecting real habits or embellishing heroic ideals? Some argue sagas were written centuries after the Viking Age and may exaggerate. Others insist the consistency of casual details points to truth. It remains one of those historical puzzles where interpretation matters as much as evidence. Now think about the poetry itself. Skaldic verses sometimes describe halls filled with the smoke of embers or the press of men under beams. These images are indirect, but they give texture to the reality. Smoke thick enough to inspire metaphor, crowded benches noteworthy enough to weave into poetry. Even where poets aimed at grandeur, the mundane details of sleep slipped through. One odd tidbit: in some tales, restless nights are described in terms of supernatural disturbance, spirits whispering, dreams weighing heavily, ghostly visitors pressing on sleepers' chests. Were these just narrative devices, or reflections of what smoky, uneasy nights actually felt like? Anyone who's woken in a cramped, coughing haze knows how easily dreams bleed into dread. Perhaps the sagas captured that disorientation more honestly than they meant to. You can feel it yourself as you lie here, half waking in the longhouse. The rafters loom overhead, shadows from the fire twisting like spirits. A child stirs, mutters, and falls silent. Someone whispers a prayer, another coughs, and the hall settles again. In that half-light, it's easy to believe in dreams with teeth, in ancestors stepping down from smoke to speak. Historians also use these texts to gauge social practice. The order of seating at feasts often mirrored the order of sleeping, with the most honored closer to the fire, the less important drifting toward the door. A saga describing someone's place on the bench is more than furniture. It's a reflection of status woven into every night's sleep. Even unconscious, hierarchy shaped who froze and who stayed warm. Another charming sliver, the word ***, meaning bed, appears in Old Norse texts but often referred not to a private frame, but to bedding straw. Furs, cloaks spread wherever one lay. That language itself tells us that a bed was less a structure and more a bundle. You weren't given a room. You were given a ***, a nest of materials, whether on a bench or on the ground. The vocabulary mirrors the reality. Sleep was portable, flexible, and never as private as we imagine. Scholars still argue over how much weight to give these poetic hints. Some treat them as cultural memory, useful snapshots of daily life. Others caution that they were literary devices shaped by later Christian scribes, and not always reliable. Yet, When combined with archaeology, the pieces align enough to create a picture. You're left with a hall that smells of smoke, benches lined with straw, bodies wrapped in cloaks, and stories fading into snores. The sensory texture of this literary evidence matters. Think of hearing sagas recited while lying in the longhouse. The words rise above the crackle of fire, weaving images of gods and battles while you scratch at fleas under your cloak. The heroic and the mundane mix seamlessly. Sleep in Viking times was never divorced from story. It happened in the middle of them. So as you roll onto your side, soot stinging your eyes, you realize that sagas are more than entertainment. They're windows, however smoky, into the way people lived and slept. They don't describe luxury. They describe survival, woven into story. And as you drift off, you wonder if tomorrow's storytellers will remember you too, scratching in the dark, muttering by the fire. Just another body pressed into the longhouse night. The hall tonight feels almost festive. The benches are crowded not just with family, but with neighbors and travelers. A feast has spilled into the night, and the warmth it brings is more than emotional. In Viking society, winter feasts were as much about surviving the cold as about celebrating gods and kin. The fire burned brighter, the food richer, the drink flowing, and all of it left bodies flushed and ready to collapse into sleep. A longhouse packed with revelers was paradoxically warmer than on quieter nights. Archaeological traces of such gatherings appear in the form of oversized halls, some far larger than what a single family needed. These so-called feasting halls contained wider hearths, more benches, and sometimes evidence of mass cooking. The sagas too speak of banquets stretching deep into the night, where songs were sung, boasts shouted, and meat consumed in dizzying quantities. After such excess, the benches and floors must have been strewn with sleepers, men and women dropping wherever space allowed, cloaks pulled over their heads, bellies warm with stew and ale. One well-established detail is the importance of Yule, the midwinter feast. It wasn't just about ritual sacrifice or honoring gods. It was a practical explosion of food and fire at the darkest time of year. Eating heavily in the coldest weeks ensured strength for the lean months ahead. And when dozens gathered in the hall, the combined heat of their bodies raised the temperature significantly. You can almost feel it now. The air thicker, the frost outside beaten back by laughter and sweat. A curious tidbit comes from saga anecdotes where drunken guests were described as toppling onto their cloaks and sleeping near the hearth like logs beside the fire. These weren't private sleeping arrangements. They were communal collapse. One can imagine waking in the night to find a stranger's elbow across your chest or tripping over someone who had dozed off mid-song. The longhouse after a feast must have resembled a battlefield of snores. Bodies sprawled in chaotic comfort. Scholars debate how often such large gatherings took place. Some argue they were annual or seasonal, tied to festivals like Yule or harvest. Others suggest that in wealthier communities, feasting was frequent, a way for chieftains to display generosity and maintain loyalty. Either way, the result was the same. On feast nights, the hall became both warmer and noisier, a temporary shelter not just from cold, but from loneliness. Now let your senses paint the picture. The fire burns fiercely, spitting sparks high into the smoke-filled rafters. The smell of roasted pork and spiced mead still lingers, clinging to wool cloaks and beards. The floor is sticky with spilled ale. The benches are crowded with drowsy revelers. Music has faded into murmurs, then into the guttural rhythm of snores. The warmth is almost oppressive, your cheeks flushed even as drafts whisper through cracks in the wall. You drift off not to silence, but to the fading hum of community. There's a deeper psychological comfort in this too. A hall full of guests meant more than heat. It meant security. Strangers lying nearby were allies for the night, and their presence made raids or dangers less likely. The clamor of bodies was not just physical insulation. It was social insulation against fear. Oddly enough, later medieval writers sometimes sneered at these feasts, describing the Norse as gluttonous, drunken, or chaotic. Yet behind the criticism lies a truth. Feasts worked. They reinforced social bonds, filled bellies, warmed bodies, and carried people through the harshest nights. What outsiders mocked as disorder was, for the Vikings, another survival strategy. Still, scholars continued to puzzle over the role of these nights in daily rhythm. Did families sleep worse on feast nights, disturbed by noise and crowds, or did the extra warmth outweigh the inconvenience? Reenactments in reconstructed halls suggest the latter. Many bodies in a closed space raise the temperature enough that even thin bedding feels luxurious. Discomfort was tolerated when it meant not freezing. Imagine now curling up on your straw mattress, cloak over your head, while around you dozens of others snore and mutter. Somewhere nearby, a man talks in his sleep, boasting of victories. A child whimpers in a dream. The fire pops. A drunk uncle groans. And the hall shifts with the restless tide of communal slumber. It is messy, loud, and yet oddly comforting. You are carried by the warmth of food, the buzz of drink, and the nearness of bodies. As dawn creeps in, the hall will stir with groans and laughter, stories retold of who snored loudest, who spilled ale, who tried to climb onto the wrong bench. The memory of warmth will linger longer than the hangover. For in the Viking world, nights like these were not interruptions to survival. They were survival itself, disguised as celebration. So you sink deeper into your furs, belly full, head buzzing faintly, and you understand the quiet brilliance of Viking feasting. It wasn't mere indulgence. It was insulation against the cold, against despair, against the loneliness of winter. And in that crowded, smoky hall, you let the hum of humanity lull you into sleep. The embers glow low, and you wake to find a stranger curled not far from your feet. His cloak is travel-stained, his boots still caked with frozen mud. He isn't family, not even a neighbor, but he has been given a corner of the bench for the night. Hospitality was not a luxury in the Viking world. It was a law of survival. If a traveler appeared at your door in winter, you didn't leave him to freeze. You brought him into the smoky longhouse, shared fire and food, and gave him space to sleep, however cramped. The sagas are full of references to this custom. Visitors asked for fire and seat as a matter of right, and hosts were judged by how generously they gave it. Archaeologists back this up with the sheer size of some longhouses. Many were built large enough not only for families and livestock but for guests. The unspoken rule was clear. In the north, a closed door could mean death. A house that opened itself earned honor. A house that refused shamed its owner. You could almost feel it as you roll over in your imagined bedding. The stranger exhales, his breath mingling with yours in the smoky air. His presence makes the hall warmer, though less comfortable. His snores join the chorus. His body heat adds to the pool of warmth. You might mutter about his smell, but you know you would want the same kindness if you arrived here half frozen on a stormy night. One firm detail from saga literature is the idea of the gestastofa*, or guest space, sometimes mentioned in Icelandic texts. Whether this was a literal room or simply a designated part of the hall, It shows how central hospitality was, even in cramped longhouses. Some space, no matter how drafty, was reserved for newcomers. Here's a quirky side note. Some stories mention guests being expected to share gossip or news in return for lodging. Hospitality wasn't only warmth and food. It was information exchange. Imagine lying half asleep, listening to a traveler whisper about distant markets, kings or storms, while children pressed close to hear tales of lands they would never see. A guest could bring warmth not just to the body, but to the imagination. Scholars still debate whether this generosity was entirely altruistic. Some argue that Viking hospitality was strategic, part of a culture where reputation mattered more than wealth. To be known as a generous host meant allies in times of need. Others suggest it was simply pragmatic. Turning away strangers might breed enemies or curses. Either way, the longhouse became a revolving door of humanity, where family, kin, servants, and travelers all shared the same smoky roof. Now, picture the sensory overload of such a night. You already sleep beside children and livestock. Add to that a handful of travelers, still damp from snow, their cloaks heavy with frost melting into puddles on the floor. The smell thickens: sweat, wet wool, manure, fish oil from lamps. The benches are crowded, straw flattened by unfamiliar bodies, elbows and knees pressing into your ribs. Privacy, already a scarce luxury, vanishes altogether. Yet the warmth rises, the hall feels fuller, and the night becomes survivable. There's even evidence from burial sites that some travelers were honored enough to be laid to rest with bedding goods. Perhaps their status as guests carried symbolic weight, linking the act of being hosted in life to being hosted in death with furs and cloaks. If true, it reveals how deeply the idea of sharing warmth ran through Viking culture. Think also of the emotional balance. Welcoming strangers meant safety and potential friendship, but it also meant risk. Was this man by your feet truly harmless? Did he carry sickness, secrets, or intentions less friendly? Lying in the smoky dark, you might wonder, even as you shared your fire. Trust was forced by necessity, tested nightly in every guest who laid his head on your straw. And here's a detail that might make you chuckle. Later medieval sources grumble about rowdy guests who drank too much and overstayed their welcome, as if Viking hosts sometimes regretted their generosity. You can picture the frustration of dragging a drunken traveler out of the hall at dawn, wishing you had left him outside in the snow. Yet the law of hospitality overrode annoyance. The hall was a lifeline, not just for kin but for any who knocked out, so you close your eyes again, feeling the stranger's breath and the shared warmth of the longhouse. His presence is uncomfortable, yes, but necessary. In the Viking world, no one survived winter alone. Hospitality was the thread weaving families, villages, and strangers into one fabric. It was noisy, smoky, and crowded, but it was life. And as you drift into uneasy dreams, you realize the hall itself was less a house than a living network of survival, binding together everyone who needed its heat. The hall quiets again, but in your mind, you wander to the graves left behind. Archaeologists digging through centuries of earth find not only weapons, jewelry, and tools buried with the dead, but also bedding, straw imprints, fragments of furs, tufts of wool, even whole blankets folded carefully beside a body. To the Vikings, the way you slept in life echoed into death. A grave without warmth was unthinkable. One of the clearest examples comes from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, where two women of high status were laid on beds draped in textiles and animal hides. The fragments of fabric, though decayed, reveal elaborate weaves and dyes luxury bedding for a final voyage. Archaeologists note that even ordinary graves often contain traces of wool and fur. It's as if every Viking, no matter how poor, was ensured a bed for eternity. The logic is simple but profound. If warmth meant survival in life, it surely mattered in the afterlife. A dead child was wrapped in a fur blanket. A warrior was laid with his cloak. A woman was given her bedding as if she might need to rest after the long journey to the other world. In these burials, you see the cultural truth that sleep and death blurred together, both needing comfort, both needing warmth. Here's a curious tidbit. In some graves, archaeologists have found feathers mixed with wool, suggesting that down pillows or mattresses were not unheard of. These seem to belong mostly to elites, a sign that even in death, status dictated softness. You can picture the contrast, one man buried with rough straw, another with downy feathers, both still chasing warmth, even in silence. Specialists continue to debate how symbolic these burial goods were. Were they meant literally to comfort the dead on their journey, or were they simply representations of wealth, showing that the deceased had owned fine bedding? Some scholars argue for spiritual utility, others for social display. As usual, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. But whether symbolic or practical, the message is clear. Bedding mattered. Furs, wool, straw, these were as central to identity as weapons or jewelry. The Vikings saw no separation between survival and meaning. To them, the blankets that kept a family warm also carried them into the next world. Now imagine standing at a burial mound. The air is cold, and families gather to lay someone to rest. They drape him in his cloak, tuck a fur around him, maybe even spread straw beneath his body. The gestures are quiet, tender, and familiar, the same motions they made every night in the Longhouse, now repeated one last time. To bury someone was to put them to bed, and to believe that beyond this sleep, warmth would still matter. Think too of the sensory echoes. The smell of wool, the texture of fur, the crunch of straw under a corpse all remind the living of nights shared in smoky halls. Funerals weren't alien events. They were extensions of daily rituals. The bedding that cradled the dead was the bedding that had cradled the living every night. One peculiar find from Birka in Sweden revealed a child's grave lined with birch bark beneath the straw. Scholars wonder if this was extra insulation or perhaps symbolic purity. Either way, it shows that even the smallest details of comfort carried into burial practices. The dead were not sent naked into the soil. They were wrapped as if for sleep. The sagas too preserved glimpses of this overlap. Warriors are described as lying down with cloaks pulled tight, both in life and in death. The same language bridges the two states, reinforcing the cultural idea that sleep and the grave were neighbors. Death was simply a longer night, one for which bedding was still required. And here's another intriguing observation. Many graves place animals near humans, horses, dogs, even cattle. Some interpret this as symbolic companions, but consider the nightly reality of the Longhouse, where animals slept only a partition away. To lie beside beasts in death may have mirrored the closeness of life, when a cow's breath warmed the hall and goats bleated through the dark. Scholars still disagree about how much emphasis to place on this. Some argue that bedding in graves was primarily about status, a way to flaunt textiles and furs that were costly. Others emphasize spiritual symbolism, pointing to beliefs in a journey after death that required rest and warmth. Both views carry weight. What's certain is that Viking burials show an unusual attention to the materiality of sleep. Now let yourself feel it. Imagine lying in your cloak, knowing it will one day wrap you in the earth. Imagine smoothing a fur over a child, aware that someday such a fur might rest in a grave. In a world where every night was a battle against cold, death itself was imagined as another night to endure. Warmth, both literal and symbolic, remained the great safeguard. So as you curl again on your imagined bench, scratching at straw and tugging your cloak closer, you realize that the Vikings didn't separate life, sleep, and death. All three flowed together, each shaped by the same furs, cloaks, and fires. To live was to fight the cold. To sleep was to fight it together. To die was to carry that fight into another realm. Wrapped in the same bedding that once held you through countless nights, the hall tonight feels different, more restless, more unsettled. Sleep doesn't come easily, and you sense why. In Viking culture, the night was not merely a time of rest. It was a time of danger. Darkness was filled with uncertainty, with whispers of raiders, spirits, and dreams that might not be dreams at all. To lie down under your cloak wasn't just to close your eyes against cold. It was to place your trust in the fragile defenses of wood, fire, and community. Sagas give us glimpses of this unease. Characters sometimes describe being kept awake by fear or rising in the night to check doors and fires. The Longhouse was never impregnable. Its walls of timber and turf could keep out frost. But what about thieves slipping through the dark? What about enemies who waited for families to sink into slumber before striking? One saga tells of raiders bursting into a hall at dawn, cutting down men still groggy from sleep. Nights were not always safe havens. They could be traps. One thing archaeologists often point to is the presence of weapons near sleeping areas. Graves show swords laid at the sides of men and women. Even children were sometimes given knives. This suggests that weapons weren't locked away. They stayed close, ready to be seized at a moment's notice. Imagine lying down with a spear propped against the bench, its shadow stretching across the smoky wall. Sleep came, but lightly, always with one ear open for the crunch of snow outside. Here's a curious tidbit. Sagas occasionally mention dogs sleeping in halls as guardians. Their barks would cut through the night if strangers approached. Dogs were more than companions. They were alarm systems. A restless growl in the dark might send a man's hand groping for his axe before he even opened his eyes. So even as warmth and family cocooned you, fear pressed at the edges of consciousness. Scholars debate how deep this fear ran. Some argue that Viking villages were tight-knit, with neighbors close enough that raids were rare and nights mostly peaceful. Others insist that sagas reflect genuine anxiety, that violence could arrive at any moment. The disagreement highlights the ambiguity of evidence. But whether fear was constant or occasional, it shaped how people thought about sleep, not as surrender, but as vigilance. Now consider the sensory side of this fear. You're wrapped in furs, but every creak of timber makes your heart jump. The wind shifts, rattling the roof boards, and you wonder if it's a storm or footsteps. Smoke twists into strange shapes above the hearth, and your half-dreaming mind imagines spirits. A cough beside you reassures you, but also reminds you how thin the boundary is between life and fragility. Sleep, when it comes, feels like risk as much as relief. And it wasn't just human enemies. Folklore brimmed with creatures of the dark. Trolls, *Draugr*, and spirits were said to wander at night, pressing on the chests of sleepers, twisting dreams into nightmares. In sagas, whole households wake in terror from visitations. Were these supernatural tales just metaphors for smoke-choked hallucinations? Or did Vikings truly believe their sleep was vulnerable to attack from the unseen? Historians disagree, but the sheer number of such stories suggests they colored nightly imagination. Oddly enough, smoke itself may have fueled this. Modern studies of smoke inhalation show it disrupts sleep, causes shallow breathing, and can spark vivid dreams or hallucinations. Lying in a smoky longhouse, coughing, eyes stinging, the line between nightmare and reality blurred. A shadow in the rafters could easily become a spirit. A dream of suffocation might feel like a *DRIUGR* sitting on your chest. Night fear was built not only from sagas but from lived, smoky experience. One peculiar discovery from Icelandic farm ruins is the remains of heavy doors and locking mechanisms. Even in such remote settlements, families secured themselves carefully at night. Some scholars argue this was more about livestock theft than murder, but the message is the same. Doors were more than barriers against the cold. They were defenses against intrusion. To bolt the hall at night was to acknowledge that the world beyond the walls was not to be trusted. Think about the emotional weight of this. Every night meant balancing two truths. You needed to sleep, but you couldn't fully let go. Parents lay awake, one ear tuned to children's breathing, the other to the storm outside. Warriors clutched their swords even under blankets. Old women whispered charms to ward off spirits, muted prayers that dawn would come without disturbance. Sleep was communal, but so was fear. Scholars still argue over how fear of raids shaped Viking society. Some suggest it fostered toughness, a culture where rest was always half ready for battle. Others propose it bred cohesion. Families who slept close and trusted one another were bound more tightly by the shared awareness of vulnerability. Both views may be true, and both help explain the intense loyalty and ferocity for which Vikings became famous. So as you lie again in your imagined straw bed, you feel the contradiction. Warmth on one side, fear on the other. The fire glows, your family breathes around you, but your ears still strain for noises in the dark. In the Viking longhouse, sleep was never only about rest. It was about daring to close your eyes in a world where danger pressed against thin walls of wood and turf. And every dawn was proof not only of survival against cold, but against the night itself. The embers pulsed softly, and while bodies around you breathe in unison, another layer of Viking night presses in: illness. For all the warmth of furs and fire, the longhouse was also a breeding ground for sickness. Smoke filled lungs, pests crawled in bedding, and dozens of people shared the same air, night after night. In this enclosed world, sleep and sickness walked hand in hand. Archaeological evidence paints a sobering picture. Viking skeletons show signs of chronic respiratory issues, ribs deformed by constant coughing, lungs scarred by years of inhaling soot. Living in a smoke-filled hall may have kept frostbite at bay, but it meant lungs rarely knew clean air. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your chest rattled with phlegm, coughing yourself awake every hour. A child wheezing in the corner wasn't a rare tragedy. It was the nightly background of life. One well-documented fact is that turf-roofed houses trapped humidity. Moisture seeped through, clinging to wood and bedding. In such dampness, illnesses thrived. Archaeologists in Iceland have found mold spores preserved in turf remains, proof that the very walls may have worsened health. You roll on your straw mattress and realize it isn't only fleas you're fighting. It's the invisible fungi and bacteria drifting in the smoky dark. And then there's a grimly quirky tidbit. Lice themselves may have spread disease. Some researchers suspect that typhus-like illnesses could have circulated in these crowded halls, passed from head to head in nightly scratching sessions. Imagine a family combing lice by firelight, flicking them into the flames, not realizing they might also be flicking disease. The same warmth that bred closeness also bred contagion. Scholars continue to debate the extent of mortality tied to longhouse life. Some argue that these health risks were constant but manageable, balanced by hardy immune systems and herbal remedies. Others insist that the longhouse environment was disastrous, shortening lives and contributing to high child mortality. The evidence doesn't give us neat answers, only hints of a fragile balance between survival and suffering. Now let your senses feel this version of the hall. The smell of smoke thickens until it makes your eyes water. Someone nearby coughs harshly, their body shuddering under furs. Another stirs, restless with fever, murmuring in delirium. The straw beneath you is damp from sweat, and the air tastes sour. You shift uneasily, knowing that one sick body can ripple infection through the entire hall in a matter of days. Yet, despite these risks, families had remedies. Viking-age texts mention herbs like yarrow, juniper, and angelica used to treat ailments. A woman might scatter herbs in bedding to freshen it, or burn juniper as incense to clear foul air. Did it help? Perhaps a little. Perhaps only psychologically. But even the act of sprinkling herbs gave hope. And in a hall where smoke and fleas ruled the night, hope was another kind of warmth. One peculiar archaeological find in York uncovered latrine deposits rich with parasite eggs. Roundworm, whipworm, even tapeworms were common passengers in Viking guts. Imagine lying in the smoky hall, your stomach twisting not from hunger, but from parasites writhing inside. Sleep must have been shallow, broken by cramps and discomfort. The longhouse wasn't just a shelter. It was also an incubator of ailments. And yet, people endured. Sleep wasn't perfect, but it was enough. A child coughed and still grew strong. A mother itched and still rose before dawn to tend the fire. A man wheezed through the night and still took his axe to sea. Resilience was carved into their very breath. Scholars still wonder how Vikings themselves understood these illnesses. Did they blame smoke, or did they think spirits caused coughs and fevers? Some sagas suggest the latter, with sickness described as curses or as trials from the gods. But others hint at a pragmatic awareness. Houses too smoky made people ill, so vents were adjusted, bedding refreshed. The line between superstition and observation blurred in the haze of daily life. Think now of the emotional rhythm. Parents worrying over sick children pressed between them for warmth. Elders muttering prayers while coughing themselves to sleep. Neighbors whispering in the dark about whether illness meant bad spirits or simply bad air. The night was a theater of survival, played out not only against cold, but against disease. You can almost hear it now, the uneven chorus of snores and cough, some sharp, some wet, some lingering like shadows. The sound tells the truth. This hall is not just alive. It is alive with sickness. But still, families cling together, sharing warmth, herbs, and hope. So you settle again under your cloak, breathing the smoky air that scratches your throat. You accept that comfort and sickness are inseparable here. The same walls that protect you also choke you. The same warmth that sustains you also breeds fever. In the Viking longhouse, sleep was never simple rest. It was survival on a knife's edge, fought each night against both frost and disease. The hall groans under the weight of snow. But tonight you think less of smoke and straw, and more of what this place means beyond survival. The Longhouse is not simply a shelter. It is the heart of Viking society, where every night, sleep stitched families and communities together. To rest here was to participate in a rhythm older than memory. Firelight, shared bodies, and the endless negotiation between cold and warmth. Sleep wasn't just personal. It was cultural. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns have noticed that longhouses were almost always central in villages, larger and sturdier than outbuildings. They were status symbols, yes, but also collective anchors. When you imagine lying on your bench, it isn't just a bed. It's a place in the social fabric. Your position, your neighbors, even your bedding spoke volumes about who you were. Nearer the hearth meant higher standing. By the door meant lower. Hierarchy didn't end when people lay down. It stretched right into the smoky dark. One well-established detail comes from reconstructions. A longhouse wasn't simply residential. It was multifunctional barn, workshop, feasting hall, and bedroom rolled into one. That meant sleep was never isolated. As you lay in straw, someone else sharpened a tool at the fire. A woman spun wool by lamplight. A child coughed. An animal shifted in its stall. Rest happened in the midst of life, not apart from it. And here's a quirky angle. Some sagas describe disputes about who got to sleep where, as if benches were contested property. Arguments broke out over placement, over warmth, over whose cloak stretched furthest. Imagine bickering at night about who claimed the best spot, voices rising even as others tried to drift off. It's almost comic, domestic squabbles echoing in the same smoky rafters that had witnessed heroic boasts hours earlier. Scholars still debate how strongly these nightly arrangements influenced identity. Did growing up pressed between relatives foster stronger family loyalty? Or did it fuel resentment and rivalry? Some anthropologists argue that the Viking world's emphasis on kinship and oaths reflected habits, learned in childhood trust built under cloaks and crowded beds. Others point to saga feuds as evidence that close quarters could just as easily breed hostility. The evidence can't decide, but you can feel the truth of both as you roll over, bumping into your cousin's elbow. Now pause and picture the sensory mix of culture and sleep. The crackle of fire is also the rhythm of storytelling. The itch of straw is also the texture of shared labor harvest turned into bedding. The smell of smoke is also the scent of ritual, linking gods, hearth, and ancestors. Even rest itself becomes a cultural act. Every sigh, snore, and whispered prayer is woven into a larger fabric of belonging. One fascinating find in Iceland revealed post holes suggesting longhouses were periodically extended, lengthened over generations. This means the sleeping platforms too grew with families, stretching like living organisms. Imagine lying in a hall where your grandparents once slept, your children soon to lie beside you. The continuity of place made the act of sleeping a thread in a generational tapestry. Each night's rest was not just about today. It was part of a centuries-long pattern. Oddly enough, later folklore hints that where you slept even shaped personality. A child who always lay nearest the door, exposed to drafts, was thought to grow tough and hardy. One who always lay by the fire grew spoiled and soft. Was this superstition? Perhaps. But it reveals how closely Viking culture tied the material act of sleep to the moral fabric of life. Scholars continue to wrestle with the broad meaning of these nightly rituals. Some frame them as adaptations, purely practical fire, furs, benches. Others insist they were also symbolic, shaping identity, belief, and community. When you combine evidence from archaeology, sagas, and folklore, the picture is richer. Sleep was survival, but also story, status, and spirituality. Now feel it one more time. You lie on your straw, cloak pulled high, child pressed against your side. The fire smolders, goats breathe softly behind the partition. A cousin snores at your feet. It isn't peaceful by modern standards, but it is profoundly human. Every sense engaged, every bond tested, every night survived together. The Longhouse was more than architecture. It was culture carved in wood and wool, lived each night between sleep and waking. So as you let your eyes close again, you realize you're not just imagining how Vikings slept. You're imagining how they lived. The two cannot be separated. For them, rest was survival, community, identity, and continuity, all pressed into the smoky dark of the hall. The night stretches into its last hours, and as you lie there half waking, the entire picture of Viking sleep begins to resolve in your mind. You felt the smoke sting your eyes, the straw scratch your skin, the furs weigh heavy across your chest. You've shared breath with children, pressed knees against relatives, listened to goats shifting in the dark, and whispered prayers into the smoke. To sleep in a Viking longhouse was to surrender not only to exhaustion, but to an entire system of survival, culture, and meaning. Archaeologists and historians, piecing together fragments of bone, wood, and saga text, show us a world where no detail was wasted. A cloak doubled as a blanket, a goat doubled as a heater, a fire doubled as a spirit to be honored. Bedding wasn't merely comfort. It was a survival toolkit, a patchwork of whatever materials a household could gather. Straw refreshed with ash, wool cloaks, hides traded from far lands, sometimes even down or feathers for the wealthy. Every night was an act of improvisation, weaving together human warmth, animal presence, and spiritual trust. One firm detail that emerges is just how integrated sleeping was with the rest of life. The longhouse was no separate bedroom. It was a living organism where meals, work, gossip, worship, and sleep flowed into one another. You never escaped the presence of others. A cough might wake the hall, a story might ripple through the rafters, a dog's growl might stir hands to weapons. Privacy, silence, and stillness, these are modern illusions. The Viking night was dense, layered, alive. And then there's the quirkiness of it. Fleas hopping across furs, ale-fueled snores vibrating through the benches, children wriggling crosswise, raiders sometimes barging through the door. It wasn't serene. It was messy, noisy, itchy. And still, people rested, because rest wasn't perfection. It was enough. Survival didn't demand luxury. It demanded endurance. Specialists still disagree on how well people truly slept. Some argue segmented rest, broken into 2 or 3 cycles, allowed families to cope with fire tending and noise. Others suggest sleep was shallow, constantly interrupted, leaving Vikings in a permanent state of fatigue. The truth may never be settled, but the continuity of their world proves one thing: whatever sleep they managed, it sustained them through voyages, harvests, and battles. Now close your eyes in this imagined hall. The benches creak with shifting bodies. The fire sighs under its cloak of ash. A cow exhales softly in its stall. Beside you, a child twitches in a dream, and your partner pulls the cloak tighter around both of you. You are wrapped in warmth that is fragile but sufficient. Above you, smoke curls like a second ceiling, hiding gods and spirits in its folds. Every detail is discomfort, and every detail is survival. The Viking longhouse was not just a building. It was a ship of the night, carrying families through storms of frost and darkness. Its walls were hulls, its rafters masts, its benches bunks. By morning, if embers glowed and breath still rose, then the voyage of another night had succeeded. And so you drift into the last dream of this journey, realizing that the Vikings didn't beat winter with luxury. They beat it with closeness, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness. Each night's sleep was a victory. Each dawn was proof that the system, imperfect, smoky, crowded, worked well enough to keep life going. And now, as the story closes, let the longhouse fade. Let the smoke disperse into the night, the fire soften into ash, the bodies stretch and stir as dawn's gray light seeps through cracks in the roof. You've walked through every layer of Viking sleep, the straw, the cloaks, the furs, the coffin, the snores, the warmth of children pressed close, the vigilance of swords kept at hand. You've heard sagas whispered, felt pests crawl, seen embers coaxed to life under their blanket of ash. It was never quiet, never clean, never easy. But it was life. Now, ease into your own space. Your room may be silent, your bed far softer, your air far clearer than the smoky breath of a turf-roofed hall. But carry with you the lesson hidden in that distant world. Rest doesn't require perfection. It requires enough. Enough warmth, enough closeness, enough faith that the night will pass and dawn will come. The Vikings endured with far less than you hold now. And yet they dreamed, they woke, they built, they sailed. So as your body sinks deeper into stillness, let yourself feel the same surrender. The cold cannot touch you here. The shadows are only shadows. Every ember of your own warmth is safe, waiting for morning. Breathe slow, soften your limbs, and let the hall of history dissolve into silence. Sleep well, traveler. The night carries you gently, and dawn will always arrive.